preconditions, I guess, or what from our own existence, what can we learn? Go ahead.
Yeah, as a matter of fact,
I'm going to mute myself. It's past time.
You are. Okay, Phil, you're on mute right now, so why don't I take you off of mute?
Yeah, I was telling Donald that, as a matter of fact, I'm going to ask that question, address and ask that question later. But right now, I'm interested in asking some other question, because this is an interesting question that came up yesterday. Actually, it was a session on Hegel, but was about Microcosm, who's a Hegel scholar. As a matter of fact, the guy who's leading it is a very good Hegel scholar, and he said the way he entered Hegel was actually through Microcosm, which is sort of interesting.
Yeah.
And in the discussion, it says something interesting. It says dialectical logic is critical logic. It reveals modes and contents of thought which transcend the codified patterns of use and validations. Dialectical thought does not invent these contents. They have occurred to the notion in a long tradition of thought and action. Dialectical analysis merely ascends and reactivates them. It records, it recovers taboo meanings, and thus appears almost as a return, or rather a concern, liberation of the repressed, since the established universal of discourse is that of a unfree world. So this was interesting, because I've always thought that dialectical thinking was progressive. It moves to the future, right? It's pushed to the future, but in fact, this quote says it really isn't. It's at first, it in many ways, it reminds me to be regarded as reactionary. Now, I'm using that word carefully, because
Yes.
Reactionary, we know what it means, but
Yeah.
that's not the meaning I mean, in the sense that the repression gets to the point of such unfreedom, it reacts to the unfreedom by reacting to the hidden dimension, not from the future, but from what was always there, hidden in the past, to call it forward, to actually remind one. This actually reminds me of Plato's Forms,
Yes.
which is interesting, which was an analysis that time had made the human mind to have forgotten what the mind already already understand, recuperates from what the mind already has.
Yeah.
In that way, the hiddenness of the past is a recuperation and a reaction into the future.
Right.
It is a circular progress, wrapping the past to the present to the future. So that's very interesting. It's not a linear movement, but a kind of a circular movement that at least that forms a flow of dynamic forces, which is quite interesting, because I've never thought of Plato hooking up with Hegel, because they seem to be in different direction. But so, of course, Plato never really able to transcend the divided line to recover the past. He just believed the dialectic was there. And so that was also a kind of aspiration to recuperate the thing that's there. Now, it has two aspects. It seems like there's a direct repression in the world, let's say, through colonialism as such, in which these ideas that are repressed by the dominant forces are sublated. They never really disappear, and they recuperate because it's present in the world. The other dimension is that dialectic, by its very nature, means that every idea has within it other potential ideas that exist there already. Yeah. And so it's not like, oh, I'll just invent this thing. It's not a making process, but a kind of recuperating, finding the process is already there. And so that's a very interesting thought. I just thought I'd bring that in because Marcuse, of course, had the advantage. I don't know if you call it an advantage, but he also study with, or at least study Heidegger. So you could sort of see that dimension in Heidegger coming out as well. So I'm not sure whether that's pure Hegel or whether that's Hegel revised in light of some more dimensionality. So I wanted to bring that up because I asked a question later when we get into the text. This seems to relate to it, and perhaps you might have a comment.
Yeah, I'd be happy to comment on that. And thank you for bringing that forward. It's obviously directly relevant. Well, it may not be obvious to everyone, but it's directly relevant to the discussion. When Donald talks about form and matter and the relationship between them, in that you see it's possible to talk about form and matter in a linear way in which they're two different antagonistic categories, and there can't be, you're either one or you're the other. And this is going to be, as we go through this section C, form and matter, organicism, narrate, it's going to be a recurring theme, is what is the relationship that these things have to each other. In a class society, it's typical for people in the upper class to want them to be mutually exclusive. We're not those horrible people down there who have to labor because of their qualities. We're this other group over here whose qualities are completely different, and that's why we shouldn't have to, dig ditches and, carry poop and whatever else we expect them to do for us. But when we actually look at nature and we look at a Hegelian analysis, we find that underneath the sort of shallow pop analysis of the ways that a class society rationalizes itself, the Greeks had a deeper understanding of nature than that. They knew that meanings within a category were not flat and shallow, but there was instead this kind of nesting of meaning that they believed fundamentally. We've said before that we are all not just what we are, but we also carry within us the traces of the past and the influences of the past and the seeds of the future, so that we're like all three at the same time. We're like living some kind of amphibious existence, which is easy to misunderstand as being merely in the present, when in fact it's in all three at once. So when Marcuse analyzes Hegel in this way on the dialectic and says, what moves us forward requires going back to the past to find out what's been negated, what's been pushed away, what in defining our present selves have we decided was the bad part that we would just completely exclude from ourselves, so that we would purify ourselves and make ourselves different from that. And in so doing, not just what did we gain in creating who we are now, but what did we lose in terms of our roots and the deeper, juices of life. This is critical to Hegel's dialectic. I don't think it's Marcuse imposing an additional layer of meaning. I think it's him unfolding the implications that are already present in Hegel. Now, part of why this is such a relevant reference is, I've mentioned once or twice that before he started studying philosophy, Kenneth Smith was in college studying sociology. He wanted to become a sociologist. Herbert Marcuse is along with Weber, one of the great names in sociology. And Kenneth Smith got started reading Marcuse. So I put in the link in the chat, I put two books. They're from Kenneth Smith's recommended lifetime reading list if you want to really understand subjects. And I see which group did he put this in. If you want to understand modernity, he thinks you should read both of these Marcuse books. And you see the first one is about Hegel and the relationship between Hegel and sociology, the rise of social theories, and so forth. This is Marcuse doing his analysis of Hegel and the implications of the dialectic. So it's all of these things, they might sound like they're completely separate subjects, but this is all closely woven together. So when Kenneth started studying philosophy, he brought all of this, Weber and Marcuse and others, with him in his interpretation of Hegel and Kierkegaard and Nietzsche and Arendt and the rest. It gave him what a lot of philosophers would consider an unseemly political dimension, because he brought all this value-laden analysis to philosophy. He wasn't willing to treat philosophy as an intellectual curiosity that you look at, please yourself by analyzing it successfully, and then put back on the shelf so it doesn't touch anything. He wanted philosophy to be, to get involved in the stuff of life. And that meant you should be able to talk about anything philosophically, whether it was something pure and intellectually satisfying or whether it was, mucky and dirty and unpleasant and had a bad smell. He still thought you could bring philosophy to it. In fact, you should, because otherwise what the hell was philosophy good for? It's supposed to be the stuff of life and, understanding. So this is all directly relevant stuff. And we're gonna dig into this pretty deeply as we go into section C, and we look at what the Greek class society considered to be two absolutely separate categories, form and matter, but which the emerging Greek philosophy increasingly began to see in a dialectical relationship, just like Hegel would later say the key to the dialectics is the bud, the blossom, and the fruit, and their relationship to each other. They're not mutually exclusive. They are the past, the present, and the future. And the relationships among them tell us something about if you wanted to develop an intellect, if you started out as a live wire infant and you wanted to develop an intellect, the dialectic is directly relevant. You're not just taking a few steps over across a boundary and now you're in the safe zone of the new category. It just doesn't work like that. And so likewise, if we want to transcend the myopic entrapping qualities of these two basal faculties of the mind, we want to try to develop the mature mind that Hegel writes about and that the Greeks took for granted as essential to civilization, then we're going to have to grapple with the complicated relationship between form and matter, that they mutually interpenetrate and that they depend upon each other in ways that are complex in nature. Stephen, go ahead. You got your hand up.
Yeah, well, that was my point last week about the use of the word colonization.
Yes.
When I first started trying to read philosophy, that was 101. I can't remember the philosopher who made the point that all nature exists in a hierarchy. All nature, everything that's living engages in colonization, because life cannot be static. All life aims at an increase. If the ambition of life is purely to be static, it's not going to be around for too much longer, was the point the philosopher was making.
Yes.
It's like in this whole idea of historical colonization, the Great British Empire came along and made the world great with its whatever. It would come to some place and the natives themselves had been busy colonizing each other, engaged in warfare, engaged in domination. But the tragedy was the British Empire came along and introduced a new set of rules, which was very disappointing for the natives because they were quite used to empire building under their own set of rules, and they just didn't know how to cope with the new set of rules. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Yeah, it's true that nature is not at all about stasis. It's about dynamism. And part of the reason for that is that the conditions that we live within ebb and flow and change. If we make the mistake that the Germans made late in World War II, where they would give the plain pilots just barely enough fuel to get there and drop the bombs and get back, then we'll have the problem that the Germans had, where anytime there was a headwind, the planes ended up burning more gas than expected and falling out of the sky before they could get home. There is this thing about efficiency, perfect efficiency, exactly matching, how many resources you set aside to what you expect your needs to be, it becomes a kind of mental illness, an obsession, where you think, well, the numbers work on a spreadsheet. It ought to work that way in life. But when we look at nature, what we see is that nature long ago learned the lesson that you have to be prepared for far more than you're expecting to come along. And so a tree doesn't produce one fruit with one seed because it needs one offspring. It produces insane amounts of fruit with insane numbers of seeds, because it's like, the tree doesn't, it's obviously without a single neuron to be found anywhere within it. The teleology of the tree is based on the idea, I have no idea what's going to happen tomorrow. I mean, all the other trees could burn down and it could be up to me to repopulate this entire forest. I don't know what's going to happen. I need to be ready for anything. You look around in nature and you see all of these organisms sort of profligate in their productivity, trying to, massively overproduce and overprepare. And the result is that it creates a shock absorber for life, a resiliency, that it's got enormous amounts of excess capacity. There's interesting studies that have been done about things like, is it wasteful for people to keep pets that have no utility value? It's like, well, you can't get fur or milk or meat. All you're doing is wasting resources by feeding them. This was a common analysis you would see in the 20th century, where they'd say these cultures must be defective. This must be late stage, rot of the culture, that they're engaging in these non-productive activities. And what they fail to understand is, with this or with any of a variety of seemingly non-directly useful activities, what a culture is actually doing is generating more than it strictly needs at the moment and finding outlets for that excess production. And that gives it the capacity to produce more when it actually does need it, which will happen sooner or later. So again, that resiliency built into the system, which an efficiency-minded person might mistake for waste, turns out to be the very basis for the resiliency of a system. So you're right, Stephen, you see that in life, that life wants to multiply and spread. There's a lot of complexities to it. It doesn't have to be a strictly numeric spread. Like in the case of a tree, most of the fruit, most of the seeds never turn into a tree. So it doesn't necessarily turn into a direct numbers game, but it does turn into a capacity game. It's, like when Donald was talking about the way you engage in a different kind of sport or martial art, your body changes and it prepares itself, not just for what you did, but for what the body thinks you might do tomorrow based on what you just spent the last semester doing. It's like, well, if we're doing ballet, I guess I better start working on my toe bones and, shift my balance of weight a little lower in the body so that I don't fall over quite as often. All these changes happen, and it's about more than a numbers game. It's also about reconfiguration and developing capacity. There's a lot of interesting things at work here. Geneva, go ahead. You got your hand up. Come off mute.
Yeah, I'm sorry I was late. My Wi-Fi wasn't working or something. I don't know what happened, but anyway, I'm very happy to be here. And I just started recently studying philosophy, and I'm just astounded at how much of it overlaps. And how many of these philosophers kind of overlap with each other. And I think it's kind of what Phil and Steve were saying. Like one of them, I guess Plato would be the seed. And then from that seed, it blossoms and blossoms. Because yesterday, I was talking with somebody who's been studying this, and he was saying, the way I understood what he was saying is basically life situations are all about our being in the cave. And then we reach that state of aporia, I think he called it, where we're all completely confused and don't know what the hell we're doing. And that's where he says Socrates wanted us to be, because at that point you start scrambling and climbing and scratching and clawing to find what he said was the truth, the beautiful, and the good. And it's just a continuous, seemingly continuous flow. Like no matter where I go, it's never what I thought it was going to be in my initial engagement. And then it becomes something else, and then it comes something else, and then I have to just keep, like bouncing around until I guess I'm looking for the beautiful, the good, and the true. I don't know, but
Right.
yeah, it's like nothing ever turns out the way I think it's going to turn out. Nobody I know turns out to be the person ultimately that I thought they were when I first met them. And so it's so interesting. And I think Phil mentioned Hegel, and I'm in a group that I just started reading Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit, which also seems to me about the bud, the flower, the seed, so it all sort of overlaps
It does.
with each other. And it's so much fun to start peeling these layers of the onion. Like Steve said, you start to see the good, the beautiful, and the true for now, because it'll change next week or tomorrow or this evening, who knows? But it's a lot of fun. So I'm loving these discussions. They're really good.
Glad you're enjoying it, Geneva. Thanks. Yeah, that what you're talking about in Zen Buddhism and in martial arts, they call it beginner's mind. And it is the most highly prized of the great attributes that the great masters try to cultivate in themselves. They're like, the great danger of learning is that you start to think you have all the answers, and you don't really get to mastery until you realize that the answers you've got are really just the scaffolding to get you into the way of thinking about the world, and that beyond that, which you're struggling to do, and this again is the dialectic all over again. The black belt level is the level at which now you know that you don't know everything. You know it in a deep way, and you know that you're never going to know everything, but that the pursuit of knowledge is worth it, even though there's no finish line. There's, in the beginning, you don't know anything, but you don't know it. But at the mastery level, you don't know anything, which is why that's what Socrates said, right? If I am the wisest of men, it is only because I know that I know nothing, which was his resolution to what the Oracle at Delphi said about him, which troubled him so much. It's like, well, okay, the only way that I could be considered wise is if I know what a fool I am. And that proclamation has been the model ever since for people looking at this. So let's dig into this, because I mean, this is the whole point of Millennia and Microcosm, is Kenneth Smith is trying to help us understand to what extent, as moderns, are we acculturated to think we do know everything, that we're the smartest and bestest of all epochs that have ever existed. We see everything exactly the way it is, objectively, truly, no distortions at all, where we're really just seeing reality. And no previous epoch ever thought it had such a complete grasp on nature before. The medievals might have had their orthodoxies, but their orthodoxies were pointing outside the world to the medieval version of God, saying, ignore nature. Nature is meaningless. Just look at, listen to our script, our sermons, and read our scriptures, and that's all you need to know. Even the medievals didn't claim to understand nature completely, or to think that they saw it exactly as it is, and the ancients certainly didn't either. So it's something new in the world, and moderns don't know this about themselves, that we think we are seeing things the way that they are in a way that's weirdly overconfident. It gets in the way of the beginner's mind. It makes us settle for half answers and not look more deeply when we should. So the project of this whole book is to shake us loose from that by helping us to see how people used to see the world differently than we do. So we're in section C, form and matter, organicism, and arete. I in the chat, I laid out the 8 sections that make up his discussion of ancient civilization, just for context, just for reference, so we can see we're working on section C, the 3rd section, on form and matter, organicism, and arete. Each of these lettered sections builds upon the arguments of the previous section and weaves it all together. So it gets more complex as we go along from section to section, because now we're taking into account the previous ideas. And the goal is, by the time we finish these 8, we should have a reasonable approximation of the ancient worldview, how they saw the world very differently than the way we see the world. And in A and B, we already began to see some of those differences between how they saw, for example, nature or how do you decide what's true, or the notion that we're always changing. There's these things that they took for granted that for us are still controversial, and lots of people don't believe them. We're now wrestling with this issue of form and matter, like Donald said before we started the recording. What is the relationship between the two? What did it mean to the Greeks? And like Stephen alluded to, in other discussions prior to this book, when introducing the ancient worldview, Kenneth Smith would talk about this particular aspect in terms of hierarchies. The Greeks believed that if you look at nature, not only can you see hierarchies, but it's patently obvious there's hierarchies, right? I mean, the tree produces the flower. You don't ever see a flower and then suddenly an entire tree grows out of that flower. It's never, there's a hierarchical relationship between them. It's not until you finish the whole dialectic of going through the fruit and the seed and the sprout that you get to a whole new tree again. There's an order to things. And in that order, there are hierarchies of importance, right? So an existing tree is producing enormous numbers of seeds, and most of the seeds never grow into another tree. So there is, when we're talking about, the reality of the tree itself has precedence over any of its seeds. Most of them are never going to become a tree, even though under the right conditions, a few of them will. It says it is normal to the Greeks to look out and see hierarchies. That's just what they see. And it's normal for a young child who hasn't yet been fully acculturated by the dominant culture. The more you raise them out in a blackberry patch in the woods away from television and movies and so forth, the more they spend their afternoons watching bees and dragonflies and flowers and trees, the more they'll see too what the Greeks saw and what indigenous cultures see too, which is there is an order of precedence here. So to the Greeks, the idea that there are natural hierarchies in nature means that the hierarchy of meaning that we've talked about before, the ancient hierarchy of meaning, I'll put this in the chat, that it goes nature, then the sacred, then the human, aka nature, God, man. That hierarchy is not just something, I lost a comma there. That shouldn't be God, man. That should be nature, comma, God, comma, man. That hierarchy was more conscious to them as their source of meaning than our hierarchy is to us. They were more aware that they were doing value judgments based on this hierarchy and deciding who's the source of truth than we are. If you told an ancient, is nature above the gods and are the gods above man, you wouldn't get enormous arguments and flame wars on the equivalent of the internet back in the day, because they knew that about themselves. But if you tell a modern what is the most obvious thing in the world once you've seen this analysis, which is that the modern hierarchy is man on top, then nature, and then the gods, because we dethroned the medieval god and ended up with this upside down hierarchy, most moderns will say, "Nuh-uh, you can't tell me what I think." Right? They're so busy trying to not be pinned down and trying to claim to be individuals that they don't actually know themselves. They're just, this is Kenneth calls this contrarian. They just have a rebel without a cause. They're just determined to be, we're all individuals, like that scene in Monty Python and The Life of Brian, an entire crowd of people calling out, "We're all individuals." And the one guy in the back going, "I'm not." And the people next to him going, "Shh, don't say the heresy." This is how we are. If you try to characterize a modern, they're like, "No, I'm not. I'm not like everybody else. I'm my own person. I'm totally different." And they don't notice that all around them are billions of other people saying exactly the same thing at exactly the same time, right in sync. "We're all individuals," they say, like one great chorus. So, you tell them, "Hey, do you think that you privilege human perspectives above nature? Do you have some kind of weird idea that nature is meaningless and you can do whatever you want with it and it doesn't matter? And that the gods are like, a hobby that you go to on Sundays and less important even than nature? Do you take your source of meaning from, when you're trying to put an organization together, do you say, let's have a vote and see what all the people think? And then you sort of ignore, was this even feasible? Or is it even moral? What do the gods want from you? You sort of ignore all that stuff and focus on the process of digging out human opinion. And even if they do it, even if they did it yesterday and they'll do it tomorrow, today they'll tell you, "No, not me. No, I'm not bound by any hierarchies." we have this sort of egalitarian, chaotizing, hyper freedom idea of ourselves and where our opinions come from that doesn't actually describe where our opinions come from, but we think it does because we like the ideology of it. We like the ideology of absolute freedom. And so that it acts as a thought terminating cliche and encourages us not to dig deeper to find out, is that how we actually behave? Or is that just a rah-rah slogan that we say in order to make ourselves feel free? This level of self-confusion about hierarchies and our relationship to them wasn't present in the same way among the ancients. The ancients knew perfectly well that they thought all of the gods were expressions of nature and are therefore subject to nature because they're only parts of nature. You know, their Zeus wasn't the god of everything. He was only the god of specific things. Same for Ares or Athena or Aphrodite. They knew what they were the gods of. And they knew that those things they were the gods of were nature itself in its different aspects. And they knew that both the level of nature and the level of the gods had authority over us. They knew there was a hierarchy to things. And they built their whole civilization comfortable with that. So it's not surprising that they made class societies and then didn't lie to themselves about it. You know, if the Greeks or the Romans created a slave society, they would just forthrightly say, hey, this is a slave society. We've got slaves. We've got slave masters. This is what we do. We may try to rationalize it. We may try to, justify it. We may try to structure it, either more or less functionally. But what we won't do anywhere in the ancient world is we won't make a slave society and then go, no, we don't have any slaves. That's a modern thing to do. Moderns love to hide their hierarchies, right? So we may be utterly dependent upon peasants in Guatemala to farm bananas for us at subsistence, pay scales. But most Americans couldn't tell you that's where their bananas come from. We think that's not happening. And it's the same throughout the structure of modern civilization. Mostly, we hide the hierarchies because we have this concept of radical egalitarianism being equated with justice. And so we want to make it easy to tell ourselves that we're being egalitarian, even if we're not. And if we hear that somebody has authority over us, we feel resentment about it. You can find enormous numbers of young people in America who are dreaming of the day when they can upload their consciousness into a computer so that they can be liberated from their bodies. It's called transhumanism. It's a whole movement. And they're obsessed with it. They really think that's the future. If we could just escape the trap of their body, they hate their structure of their body having authority over their mind. They hate it. They want ultimate freedom. They want to be free like they imagine gods are free. They want what Heraclitus would call sort of a sick, impossible level of freedom. We talked about last week this idea that there are things in nature that if you're free from them, you can't exist at all. If you're free from electromagnetism, you can't exist. Like literally all the molecules in your body collapse and fall apart without electromagnetism. It's what holds the whole damn thing together. And the idea that you want to be infinitely free is just insane. It's like wanting to be free of all germs. I want no bacteria and no archaea. Well, great. Now you don't have a digestive system. Now you chew up and swallow an apple and you can't digest it and you starve to death because they're doing all the work. You have achieved your goal, but your goal has killed you. This terror of hierarchies, this terror of the pathos side of life, that there are enormous amounts of life in which rather than being the actor, we have to be the actee. Rather than being the form, we have to be the matter. We have to endure and suffer enormous amounts of existence in order to exist at all. This is, to moderns, some kind of sin because we dream of this ultimate impossible freedom. When you look at this sort of thing over and over, you can hear the ghost of Heraclitus, the philosopher before Plato, saying, it would not be better for men if they got exactly what they want. People want impossible things. He was saying this back in the ancient world when, they took for granted that they had to be under the authority of the gods and nature. But we don't even accept that much. We still dream of flying through the stars in impossible starships that somehow don't have any room for agriculture. It's like you walk down these, you watch Star Trek and you see a mile after mile of empty, sterile halls with no plants to be found anywhere. And somehow human beings are going to exist in that matrix and hurl themselves faster than the speed of light. We dream of that. We dream of escape from, the earth. We dream of all these things, and we want them badly. And for many people, that's what makes life worth living in modernity. They suffer things in their politics or their economics that they hate, but they tell themselves it's okay because, me or my descendants will fly in starships, and, we'll all be we'll all beam ourselves down to planet surfaces, and we'll be able to do all these crazy things, and maybe we'll be able to do some part of that. I mean, my cell phone, right? This is like a tricorder and communicator in one. There's a little bit of Star Trek in modern life, but I haven't noticed myself flying through the stars in spaceships lately, and the way that things are going, it doesn't seem to be anywhere on the short list. So hierarchies, right? Resistance to hierarchies or acceptance of hierarchies. This whole topic of hierarchies is directly related to the question of our willingness to recognize that we are not pure egos free to design ourselves in the world, but rather we are a complicated mix of the active and the passive. And if Hegel is right, the active in us develops out of the passive in us. If it weren't for the passive part, we could never think a single thought that a modern was willing to recognize as a thought. It emerges, it develops over time organically, like the blossom from the bud. And the fact that we want the one without the other kind of shows how weirdly disconnected we are in our allergy to hierarchies. All this topic of form and matter, this is all about this subject. This is what we're going to go through in section C in great detail. So why don't I call on Geneva and then Phil, and then we'll get into the text. So,
well, I just have a question, which maybe you guys have already covered and I'll understand it, but I'm not quite sure I understand what you mean when you say form versus matter. And I think Donald mentioned it at the beginning and I totally missed it. So I'm sorry if I'm going backwards here, but I'm a little bit unsettled about what that means.
not at all. In fact, that's what this section is about. So we're about to get into it.
Oh,
Yeah,
okay. Okay, then I'll just
you're not
wait.
behind, you're ahead.
Oh, okay. I'll wait then.
So yeah, you're good. We're gonna get into that.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. Phil, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm going to address the second paragraph of C.
Yeah.
And what I'm focusing on is this quote: "A horse cannot be trained by the same methods as a child or a cat." Then I skipped a couple lines that said ... "Nature works and idiosyncratic chemistry on every being or creature. Nothing simply is. Existence is a variable kind of task or challenge, even mystery, of orchestrating specific resources toward a special end. Life calls for an intelligence more like art than science." Very interesting comment. And then I thought I have a comment and I have a couple of questions after that. This leads me to wonder, on the one hand, Heraclitus did leave his writing at the Temple of Artemis.
Yes.
Who's the muse of the arts as well as the goddess of hunt. At the Temple of Artemis, rather than either Dionysus or Apollo. Seems to me Artemis was the third that mediated between the force of life and the intellect. One must say the goddess that mediated the ontological difference between heaven and earth, not so different from the third of the Holy Trinity between God the Father, Yahweh, the divine Son, Jesus, and the mediator, the Holy Spirit, which I suppose Hegel calls Geist. So this triangulation is kind of interesting because this mediation, the question I have, did Artemis hand over her artistic spirit or Geist to Apollo? Or was the Greek civilization deliver the handover from the archaic to the classical? One from emerging into being to a metaphysics. The problem with emerging unto being, it's too diversified, too much for instrumental mind to handle. It would be, wanted a dependable structure in which form would be reducible and repeatable. Thus, the domination of metaphysics that constrained the multiplicity of ontological, i.e., St. Anselm's ontological argument of the existence of God, which answer came before the question. Metaphysics, metaphysics as manifest in instrumental thinking turns out to be a reductive tunnel vision.
Yes.
I once said this, and I hope Joseph won't mind, a cartoon of this guy with buggy eyes days, and he's walking back and he says, I saw the light at the end of the tunnel. It turned out to be New Jersey. So that's interesting. My second question is, does this mean that the multiple forms in the world, it's distinct from the other? Or is this a more radical? Do we have to re-examine the relationship between form and matter, or form and content? Because form emerges out of content. Is that the true dialectic of the ontological difference? That's a more fundamental question I want to ask, is that, yes, is this an extension, a kind of revision of metaphysics through an intellect that's more liberated, a section of the reductive metaphysics of all to a kind of churning in a metaphysics that itself is a structure that's at least, well, maybe is not as dependable as the reductive logic, but it's still constrained? Or does that truly means there's an integration between form and matter, or form and content, in which the form emerges out of the content and then covers over the content, at least temporarily, and then it emerges again out of the content. So there's an interaction between the two. To me, that's a very fundamental question between ontology and metaphysics. And seemed to me a fundamental question that in some ways, maybe the Greeks have sort of messed up in passing over from the archaic to classical Greek.
Yes.
So I just want to ask those questions. I think that's almost at least one of the nexus of what we're talking about.
Yes, that's right. Thank you, Phil. So, that's the basis for an entire course right there, those two questions. So as usual, not dealing in small change, Phil, but let's talk about it. I mean, this partly goes to the nature of the twin faculties of the mind. We talk about Artemis and Apollo. There are a number of metaphors that can be drawn, but one of the ones that can be drawn is that the faculty of gnosis, which for Geneva's benefit, I'll put into the chat, gnosis, and the faculty of noesis, the other one, these have a relationship to each other like Artemis and Apollo have. Gnosis is about apprehending the whole, kind of intuiting, experiencing what it's like to be immersed in the whole. And Artemis, as the goddess of wild places and wild things and hunting, is closely associated with gnosis. Gnosis is the faculty that connects us to the world and to nature by drawing it magnetically to our attention so we can't ignore it. It makes it our focus, and it makes it therefore hard to overlook things because we're not off distracted by our ideas and our theories and syllogisms and so on. We're like, oh my God, that's the Grand Canyon. And our conversation falls away and our thinking falls away, and we just stand there dumbstruck staring at it going, wow, ain't that a thing? It overwhelms. It overwhelms our noesis. Our gnosis comes to the floor and plugs us into the moment. And there we are listening to how quiet it is. And in the far distance, is that the sound of an eagle farther away than I've ever heard an eagle cry before? And oh my God, that little speck 18 miles away that I can see hovering in the thermals. Did I just hear that? There is this, gnosis has this amazing effect on our minds. And when we are engaged in gnosis, there is a pathos to it. Gnosis is about being subject to the experience, not distancing yourself from it, not pushing it away, not insulating yourself, not negating it, not critiquing it. That whole side, the noetic side, is just shut down for a moment, and you're letting it all in, unfiltered. And because you're letting it all in unfiltered, in that moment when you stand there gazing at the Grand Canyon, you notice things that you will never notice at home looking at a picture. Even if the picture was a great photo and shows you the whole thing, you're in your room and you were doing whatever you were doing a moment ago, and maybe you can hear a car drive by outside and you just read a newspaper article that has you upset about politics, and all that stuff, that noetic stuff, is busy in your head, and the photo's not enough to overwhelm your noesis and let your gnosis come to the fore and immerse you in the experience of being there. But I assure you, you go to the north rim of the Grand Canyon, you're 8,000 plus feet above sea level, your breathing is changed. What happens when you walk is changed. The smell is different. The sounds are different. You're literally, every sense you have is telling you, you aren't in Kansas anymore, Dorothy. I don't think you're there. And so your noesis is not sure what to do, and it creates the opening for you to be immersed in the experience without filters, or with, let's say, fewer filters than you normally get in your adult life. I often compare gnosis to a peak experience. I also compare it to the experience of being an infant who has not yet learned how to filter. And it's part of why we love peak experiences, is they plug us into that part of ourselves that we're otherwise cut off from. And by being cut off from it, we can't feel like a whole person. It's like some early part of our life has been put away in a cupboard somewhere and we've forgotten quite where it is. And then we stumble out and have a peak experience, and all of a sudden we're reconnected and become whole again, not just to the moment that we're immersed in, but whole in ourselves by reconnecting to this lost part of ourself that used to live this way all the time before it learned how to develop its noesis. So there is a close relationship between gnosis and matter when we talk about form and matter. And the relationship is that in gnosis, we become the matter, and nature imprints itself upon us. Now, to an intellectual, that's intolerable, because the intellectual prides himself on his willfulness, his distance, his theories, his education. His identity is bound up with his ego imposing its interpretations upon nature. The noesis wants nature to be the matter, and it wants the self to be the form that imposes the design on nature and says, I see this schedule. I've laid out, I've measured the Grand Canyon, and here's a grid of its miles and what's in each part of the grid. It wants to schematize and organize and systematize, and in other words, make nature the matter so that the self can be the form. But in gnosis, the relationship is reversed. It's nature that is the form that imprints itself on us, and we become the matter. This inversion and the hierarchies, to go back to Stephen, the hierarchies implicit in this, the two opposed hierarchies, are why Hegel and Smith and others say that these two faculties of the mind, you can't compromise between them. You can't just find some balance point in the middle and say, well, either one by itself is an extreme, so I'll solve this problem by by moving to the middle like a herd animal, and I'll be safe here and the predators won't get me. I mean, that kind of solution doesn't work because they're not a spectrum with each other. They're antagonists to each other. They're exactly inverted. The relationship between the self and nature has been not just adjusted, but it's been completely flipped. I mean, when we talk about hierarchies of meaning, the question is who overrides whom? And in these two modes of the mind, the answer is the opposite. So in everything that we read in section C as we go forward, we're going to be investigating this issue of form and matter, but we have to do it with the understanding that what's the form and what's the matter inverts depending upon which mental faculty you're using. It makes, Phil, it makes a question that you ask like this a lot more complicated than it seems on the surface, because there's the variability of what's actually happening in terms of the hierarchies in the world. And then on top of that is our perception of the world and our relationship to it, which is yet another set of hierarchies that we're flipping back and forth between, depending on which faculty we're using. But generally speaking, I'd say Kenneth Smith would equate Apollo with form, with noesis, with the intellect, right? The planner, the light bringer who thinks that the truth can only be found in the light, right? And if we go back to Nietzsche, who's a favorite of Kenneth Smith's, Nietzsche says that Dionysus is equated with the darkness, the night, right? The revels and festivals and mysteries of the Dionysian cults happened at night. When the Apollonians said, oh, there's nothing to be seen as far as truth at night, and the Dionysians said, everything is still here at night, and it can be seen in ways you can't see during the glare of the day. And when you relax your noetic faculties and let yourself experience the world in the strangeness that it has when it looks unfamiliar again to us, then there's certain truths that we can find then that we can't find when we're all cocksure of ourselves during the day. And so Nietzsche says there is this struggle between Dionysus and Apollo for, which of these perspectives is a human being going to take on the world? What are they going to let themselves experience? It's interesting to me that they did that with Dionysus, considering that you can see in the original myth that since Artemis and Apollo are twins, they're supposed to correspond to the twin faculties of the mind. But as they dislodged Artemis and put Dionysus in her place, Artemis became less about gnosis per se and more about the nature itself that gnosis is trying to relate to. She becomes the representation of the natural world, which is the source of truth. According to the Greeks, according to section A, in Kenneth's book, that it's the source of truth that logic and intuition and all other faculties are just trying to get access to. You asked about the shift over time and where we are in the stages of civilization, and I think by the time you get to Aristotle and Socrates and the rest, they can see how Greek civilization has been shifting from the gnosic or gnomic to the noetic. It's becoming less willing to be what it is naturally and more concerned with artificially shaping itself. And it doesn't yet fully understand that if you bring everything 100% under your control, you die. It doesn't yet know that to try to make everything be fully deliberate and conscious is a terrible mistake, because the consciousness can't keep up with everything, because nature is infinite, but the conscious mind is only finite. So I know that doesn't fully do justice to your question, your two questions. It would take an entire course to fully do justice to your two questions, but I promise they'll come up again over and over throughout this chapter and throughout this book. You're right on the themes that this is all about. So I'm going to switch to Donald, and then I'm going to go back to the text. Go ahead, Donald, come off mute.
Well, I was going to try and speak to Geneva.
Oh, great. Yeah, please.
That we have this form and matter distinction, and sort of historically, it seems very simple. We get examples of the carpenter and the wood, the potter and the clay, things like that. And the potter and the carpenter provide form to the material, the wood or the clay. But where things come unglued in this simple-minded thing is, well, the wood is itself the product of an organic process that has given form. The wood had a form provided by nature, and then the carpenter put another form on top of that. And the clay was the product of, erosion, mixing of water and soil, and the sorting out of, the rocks and the organic matter to make the clay. And the potter provided form to this thing, but it already had a form provided by nature. Furthermore, to mix this up, the potter and the carpenter are themselves natural objects that have their bodies, their minds. And that's why in this you see Kenneth talk about organic things, not say, are self-organizing matter. They have these power. And that's why the thing that I was talking about before is does the lower give rise to the higher? Is it reason that shapes this? But say reason or soul or whatever the animating energy is of a living thing that shapes its own body is itself something that grows or comes to be out of the matter of that body. So it takes on that self-organizing thing. So form and matter, that seems like really simple. It's like you're making bricks or something, or doing something, or sculpting. Even the sculptor, he chisels the stone, but the stone already had a form given to it by nature. It was typically formed volcanically or under pressure or whatever. Some natural process gave it shape. And then, but you apply these categories recursively to the items, and you get the difficulty of the problem. And that's sort of philosophy 101 from how you work up to what the issue is here. And now we're going to listen to Rick talk more about self-organizing matter and how it gets to people and people acting and choosing and educating themselves.
Thank you, Donald. Yeah, that was as clear as mud. No, I'm just kidding. Just kidding.
Very clear.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
I get it.
It should be clear as clay, at least.
You're not
Of course you
alone, Evo. You're not
You can
alone.
make mud bricks or something, maybe.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you very much for that, Donald. That was the example we needed, right? Because this is the thing. One of the things that Kenneth talks about, drawing off of Hegel and Kierkegaard and others, is that when we engage in intellectual activities, they satisfy us intellectually because that's the drive the intellect has. We think that the intellect's drive is for the truth, but it's not. It's to please itself. And the moment it gets to something that pleases it, it calls it done, even if it's completely false. Even if it's not only so false that any other person looking at the conclusions we reach would laugh and go, "You were satisfied with that?" But of course, they're not the thinker, you are. And so you don't stop when somebody else would be satisfied. You stop when you're satisfied. And this is most evident when you look at something like this division between form and matter. This was very important to the Greeks because we talked before about how the Greek model of human thinking and human character developed accidentally out of the rationalizations of their slave society. first they had the slave society. They started thinking about whether that was a good idea long after they already had it. I mean, they came from descendants of cultures that, you know, took for granted you conquer other people and make them work for you, and hooray, we're Greeks. And then, you know, okay, now what? We've conquered, this is our land, now what? You know, so inevitably some people are going to try to say, well, let's shore this whole mess up and make sure that, you know, we feel good about being the ruling class. And then how are we going to do that? Well, we need an explanation for why some people rule and other people are ruled. So they start working on that. And through the normal process of cultural refinement, their first explanations are pretty laughably silly, but maybe they satisfy the first generation who didn't need much to justify what they were doing anyway. But maybe it's the second or third generation that are like, in their rebellion against their parents, are like, that's a stupid idea. That can't possibly be a justification for a class society. And some of them will become rebels and maybe get in trouble, and others will put their minds to the problem and come up with a better explanation for why some people should be slaveholders and other people should be slaves. And in the course of that, by process of elimination, by whittling away generation after generation, all of the stupidest explanations, eventually what you're left with is an explanation that's not half bad. It may not actually justify the behavior of the society, but it might actually describe human anthropology reasonably well. And maybe if you thought about it more, its conclusions would lead you to think you had to change your society now to align with this much better theory that you've got, if you were being just. In fact, that's what Aristotle says in the Politics. He says, there are some people who are slaves who, when you look at their virtues, they ought to be free. And there's some people who are free that when you look, or not only free, but ruling, who when you look at their virtues, they really ought to be slaves. If we were actually taking seriously that it's somebody's character who should determine their place in society, then we seem to be doing it wrong. You know, Aristotle is large, because of the way he was used by medievals, he's largely taken as a conservative influence. But when you read his philosophy and understand it in context, he was actually a troublemaker. I mean, you can see that he's sort of the great philosophical great-grandson of Socrates, that prime troublemaker, because here he is laying out his politics in such a way that the only conclusion that anybody who was living in the Greek world at the time could reach is, we're doing everything wrong. We've got the wrong people are in charge, the wrong people are slaves, and, you know, our governments are all corrupt. But he won't come out and say that. He just lays out a system for analyzing things such that if you actually applied it to contemporary Greek life, you couldn't reach any other conclusion. So with regard to form and matter, how can the Greeks simultaneously have a cartoonish division between form and matter, and on the other hand, have this complex understanding of the dialectics of nature? Well, it's because this is so closely related to their class system. So the oldest generation of rationalizations for their class system could afford to be cartoonish. They didn't really care if it made sense. It was just something to say to make themselves feel better over dinner. And though, as we all know from looking at our own culture, those kind of old aphorisms or pop culture statements have a tendency, or like take nursery rhymes. You know, long generations after we are no longer teaching, you know, nursery rhymes to our little kids, well, we still heard it when we were kids. And so, you know, they have a life of their own. We may not remember anymore that, you know, the bit about the rocking in the tree had something to do with overthrowing a king 3 centuries ago. We don't know anymore what these things were about, but they live on. And so this form versus matter was just a really handy metaphor that all the Greeks knew, and they had been using it for generations, and it was just at hand. We do the same thing, you know, form and matter. We talk about nature as though it doesn't impose any real meaning on the world. We say in our modern way, you are free to interpret the world however pleases you. You bring meaning to the world. This is what moderns believe. And of course, inherent in that is the belief that nature, although we don't like to think this through, inherent in that is the belief that nature is meaningless, a blank slate on which we can inscribe whatever meaning we like. The only way it would be safe to inscribe whatever meaning you like is if it doesn't mean anything, right? If it meant something, well, that could be authoritative over us. And then we would have to respect that meaning. And that would mean we couldn't bring any meaning we want to it, only the ones that are compatible. That's what the Greeks thought. You could only bring compatible meanings to nature because nature had authority over you. But we don't believe that. We think we're superior to nature. And so it makes us uncomfortable to think about the idea that nature could constrain our hands somehow. and that we aren't free to make up whatever meaning we want. In this quest for this kind of absolute distinction between form and matter, where we want nature to be absolutely passive matter, and we want ourselves to be absolutely active form that are the great designers and authors of future civilization. We are, without knowing it, because we don't know our own history, we're mimicking medievalism. This was the basis of medieval theology. You know, again, I make the distinction. I'm not talking about Christian theology. I'm talking about specifically the Orthodox medieval forms. The way that they arose was in opposition to the ancient world, Rome specifically at the time. And the opposition took the form of saying, your gods, ancient gods, aren't really gods because they're constrained by nature. And the ancients are all like, well, of course they're constrained by nature. Everything's constrained by nature. And the medieval, you know, the proto-medieval theologian said, aha, but you're wrong. Our God's better than that. Our God existed before nature and created all of nature. And furthermore, he didn't create it from wood, such that he would have been constrained by the nature of wood. And he didn't create it from clay, so they would have been constrained by the nature of clay. He created it from nothing at all, so he had no constraints at all. Ergo, he's 100% form, and everything else is 100% matter. It is a pure separation of the two. And that's the nature of a god. Ergo, your gods aren't gods, they're just demons. This was their argument. In city after city of the ancient world, the proto-medieval theologians went around as missionaries, and they gave this argument. And it was hard to refute. It was very confusing to the ancients because they weren't used to thinking in these terms. And as a result, it was very hard to refute. Well, what we don't understand is that when we want to hold ourselves up as using our science and technology to have infinite ability to mold nature to our whims, and that nature shouldn't have any claim on us or any constraints. We shouldn't be subject to any part of it. Disease, old age, gravity, you name it, our goal is to overcome that. That quest is a medieval quest. We just don't realize that what we've done is kick God out of the medieval God out of the throne and put ourselves there and say, well, it's not God who's not constrained by reality. It is we who should not be constrained by reality. We want perfectly free egos, or we want 100% noesis, able to design and plan and change anything it wants to. And we want nature to be absolutely passive and subject itself to us, for us to exploit and enrich ourselves. This is the way in which the modern recipe for the relationship between man and nature is actually just a recasting of the medieval conception of God, only where we think we're God. So, but we don't have the history for this. And since moderns like to imagine themselves as being unknowable individuals who can't be pinned down, we would just hate someone to try to say, well, aren't you just a confused medieval? It's like, no, I'm free of history. I can do whatever I want. I can be whatever I want. This is the modern lust for freedom in an impossible form. Joseph and then Phil. Go ahead, Joseph.
It's interesting because, I mean, I do a lot of reading of Stoicism, and obviously this is one area where they talked about why isn't it taught anymore,
Yes.
and specifically by philosophers in universities and things along those lines. And in reading about the decline of it, some or why it's not taught in universities, at least modern universities, is because it's the idea that you're telling somebody what to do.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the idea you're telling them that living in accordance with nature, that there's this kind of way of saying this is how you should live your life. And that's not the role of any kind of philosopher. Actually, the role of the philosopher is to focus more on language and a linguistic analysis of how to express yourself or things along those lines, which really can kind of get back to what we were talking about last week with the way, you know, language can be crafted in something like the Constitution in order to, you know, kind of make us feel like, you know, we're doing something, but we're actually not. We're deviating very far from what we were saying. We're just making ourselves feel better and not actually doing something actionable that allows us to, act better, which is, again, if you're acting in accordance with some nature, depending on what your nature is, or at least telling people that, there's this, at least, hey, this is how to act in the world. Tell me why you shouldn't act like that. And that's kind of interesting, because that would be good for good discourse. But I imagine that's why people like Kenneth sometimes aren't necessarily always the most popular people in the universities.
Yes.
So, and that's a compliment, not a,
Exactly.
So anyway, I just thought I would add that.
Thanks, Joseph. Yeah, that's a good point. He talked about the way that the students loved him. He always got top marks, but the administration and the other professors hated him because they're like, you're not allowed to do that. You can't be out there making value judgments. Value judgments are not modern. That's not philosophy in a modern sense. Like you say, in a modern sense, philosophy has to either be mincing little steps about grammar and meaning, or it's merely a cataloging of what other philosophers have written. But you can't philosophize. That's not philosophy. It's like, if all the past philosophers had held themselves inside the constraints that academic philosophy insists modern philosophers stay within, there never would have been any philosophy. And, it's like Nietzsche didn't show a lot of desire to stay within careful little frames and, not go too far. Overreaching is almost half of the game in philosophy. So, yeah, it's absurd, really, when you look at it. Anyway, Phil, go ahead.
Yeah, I almost want to address Joseph about theory in terms of writing, and to what degree it implies it's already an action. But I won't, because I want to address something else. But maybe I'll come back to it at some different point. Couple points I want to make. One is, the myth of the cave is an interesting myth because it has incorporated within it the metaphor of the sun. Because the guy who climbed out of the cave, there wasn't a sun he couldn't really see. The sun was there to illuminate the surrounding, which is nature, and see the reality of what it is. So that itself is an important myth in itself, right? A metaphor, because sun had always been important, certainly to the Egyptians and to many of the civilizations. But the sun was also a kind of interesting metaphor that made it easier to make that jump into the illumination of the mind of God. So it really preceded, in a sense, the Middle Ages of St. Augustine, right? Because if the sun illuminated the world and you could see what it is, then the mind of God illuminates the mind of man, okay? So the idea of illumination, so the concept of, in a sense, two worlds, the external world of things and the internal world of ideas and feelings and all those internalities, I think that's an important relationship, because I think, to what degree do you need the help of the sun to have some understanding of that you're out of the cave, right? If you climb out into just a total darkness, like you probably go back in, at least there's a fire inside, and you can see things. And so I think we have to recognize the relationship of the interiority and exteriority, that they are co-related. And in a funny way, Heidegger talks about that. He said, what succeeds in the Greek culture is what he called the relationship between earth and world, right? The earth exists, and the world is a production of man, a civilization, and they coexisted. Comfortably in the Greeks, temples was something that shielded, in a sense, the world. It symbolized the world. don't go beyond this. This is a holy place. And on the other hand, was also a symbol of the relationship where man could come and have a relationship with the gods and so forth. And so it's the same thing in the Middle Ages. What do we have in terms of this relationship between let's say, earth and world? In modern society, I'm not sure, is it the Eiffel Tower? Is it the mighty dollar? Is it the marketing structure? I mean, it really becomes kind of strange, because if you think of it, it's like the marketing structure is the thing that related earth and world, then it really, in a sense, oppresses and deconstructs the earth by our own creations, which is the world. So I think that's an important thing to understand. Yes, we have very, very important, internal structures, particularly one that desires to not be oppressed and be autonomous. But on the other hand, we also have to understand that there is also Earth itself, right? And so the second thing I want to bring up is I love Michelangelo's late sculptures. Not that I don't like his early sculptures. I mean, it's like the early sculptures were representations.
I'm with you.
The late sculptures of the man emerging from the stone was what I call a representation, right? And it's interesting, the men who emerged I'm sorry to say that there wasn't women, so that's another sexist thing, but nonetheless, forgive him, man is a kind of
the boys.
Yeah. So the thing that he did not emerge into this beautiful body of Apollo. It was struggling to emerge from the earth, in a sense, to become himself. So even that has a relationship between earth and world, right? The struggle to liberate yourself, but still attached. In fact, most of the body is still attached to earth, and it's not detached, because if he wanted to detach, he would just chip away all the earth, and there's the world of art. Right? And so I think that's kind of important to understand, that codependency to at least a certain degree.
Yes.
And you can't let the earth totally dominate your interiority, but on the other hand, you cannot go the other way around as well.
Exactly.
That's my thought, So
exactly.
I thought I'd present those two myths, the myth of the sun and the myth of Michelangelo's man emerging from earth.
Right on topic. Thank you. Yeah, for Geneva, I don't know if you've seen the late Michelangelo sculptures that Phil's talking about, but I'm with Phil. I think they're his best work. And the reason is that in some ways he's shifting from using sculpture to depict a subject to using a subject to depict sculpture itself, the act of sculpting. And he's showing these beautifully sculpted, just as well as he ever did at any other point, parts of human anatomy, but other parts are still in the block. And the way that the muscles are tensing, it's like the sculpture is trying to push itself out of the stone. And that was something he always said, is people would ask him how he did what he did. And he said, all I do is look to see the sculpture that's already there and help free it from the rock. And it was just from there a logical step for him to go one step further and say, well, what if I'm not the one freeing the sculpture from the rock? What if I'm just a midwife and the sculpture is trying to free itself from the rock? And so this dialectic of form and matter, to what extent is it marble, and to what extent is it the statue latent within the marble, the design, the form, if you will, and what is their relationship to each other? He's really better than most other artists I can think of. He's capturing that, to use one of Phil's favorite words, equivocation between form and matter. It's like, well, which is it? If our noetic mind wants to pin it down and put it in a category so that we can engage in logic with it, but the actual experience of form and matter is that they're deeply interconnected with each other in ways that are ultimately, and here again, Heraclitus rings his little bell, paradoxical, right? You know, the truth of an infinite world, when it is projected upon a finite mind, like the kind any mortal has, cannot possibly, if it's authentic, if it's showing nature in the most complete representation that a finite mind is capable of, it can't help but be paradoxical, because nature accommodates more dimensions than the mind can, and so they just don't fit, and so they resolve into paradoxes. And this is you know, Sharon works in medical science. This is the foundation of all medical science, that, you know, it agrees to stand with a foot on both trains. It's like, yes, we need our theories, we need our math, we need our logic, we need our noesis, but no, that's not enough, or else we end up being like the Greeks and thinking that the liver is the seat of intelligence, or what have you. And we have to also constantly going back to our gnosis, to our direct experience of things, and putting our noetic ideas to the test, so that we can winnow away all the many valid and convincing noetic ideas that are nevertheless false, and try to you know, end up with what's something we could work with to actually heal people, you know, other than just to satisfy our own desire for a consistent theory. So, all right, I'm going to do Stephen and then James, then back to the text. Stephen, go ahead.
One of the questions I come across, and this is divergent a little bit from what's been discussed here, but the ancient Hermetic wisdom divided man into, had a trichterarchemy of man, body, soul, and spirit. The interesting thing is Rudolf Steiner, who at certain moments had some valuable ideas, mixed up with all his strange ideas.
Yes.
But he referred back to a time when the Western Church eliminated the spirit out of the trichterarchemy. They said, from now on, you, man, the parishioner, are simply body and soul. And of course, some moderns will say, well, we've taken that a step further today, when in the late 19th century, the scientists discovered how the concept of the soul was so annoying. We must eliminate the soul from our view of the world.
Now we're just a body.
Well, yeah, they kept the soul in the way. They called it the mind, which was an attribute of the body. But the mind did not mean that back centuries ago. The mind meant the act of thought, not an object, a subject. They turned the mind into an object to replace the soul.
Yes.
Now, this is an interesting thing. Let's leave the body out of it for a moment. And the thing is that the ancient, the Hermetic, saw the subjective part of ourselves, which we only see or conceive of as soul today, as having two principles. One was the passive, the soul, which the church liked, you know. Parishioners, lay on your back and think of heaven, and the God will come down.
Meanwhile, we will tax you.
The ancients, the Hermetics, conceived of a subjective element they called the spirit, which was active against the passivity of the soul, which was banned. Even in Islam, you see the idea of the spirit is banned. You know, the Sufis are viewed as being as a bit heretical. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, no, that's an excellent point. There are certain ironies in the way that our concepts of what a human being is have developed, such that it has caused us to flip-flop about which part of the mind are we willing to admit exists, and which part do we insist needs to be suppressed for the good of the whole. And it's bizarre how we do these things without understanding it. And the consequences are huge, because you can't fight for something that is incredibly important to you, except you don't even know it's important to you and you don't even have a name for it. Then you don't know when it's being taken away. You have no way to talk about it or think about it. It's why Kenneth Smith says frequently, in quoting some of these other existentialist philosophers, some of the most important defining characteristics of a culture are not in what it says, but in what it never says, what must go unsaid. And that's where most of the egregious problems of a culture come about, in the unseen. So we're back to Gleitner. The unseen part is the part that has the hold over us. James, and then the text. Go ahead, James.
Yeah, so I suppose that his interpretation of Hegel would not include the religious notions about nature, right? So how does he deal with the absurd if he doesn't, if he takes that takes that out? I mean, they're because the existentialist position on the absurd, is that that nature is pretty brutal, right? I mean, so you could you don't want to idealize, nature at the same time. You don't want to be too realistic. I mean, it's very paradoxical, right?
Right.
So does he reject or negate Hegel's religious notions of nature?
Well, I think what Kenneth would say about this, and you could have some fascinating discussions with Kenneth on this topic about what is the relationship between Hegel's theology and the medieval theology that preceded him. How close are they? How different are they? And also, to what extent is Hegel's theology true to his theory of dialectics? Or to what extent did he decide to bend the dialectics to keep it from changing the theology that he inherited? This is Nietzsche's critique, right, of a lot of these early philosophers in modernity, is that they were willing to go so far and no further. And the line that they didn't want to cross is they would not bite the hand that fed them. They would not rock the boat that they were in. So if they were in academia, they were unwilling to question academia. If they were conspicuously part of an established Orthodox church, they would not question the theology of that church that they inherited, not even if it obviously followed from their own philosophy, which they applied to everything else, but they wouldn't apply it to that, because, the farther back you go in modernity, to the earlier modernity, the more the whiff of the auto da fe is still in everybody's nostrils. Everybody still smells the Inquisition, even after it's gone. Even if it never applied to them because they weren't good Catholics, they're still, there's some places you don't go. So there could be all kinds of interesting material generated by taking Hegel's dialectics and finishing what he started by applying it to the two things he absolutely didn't want to apply it to. You need to apply it to his theology and say, well, what is the nature of God if the dialectics are right? Because it sure can't be the mechanistic monad God of the medievals. It would have to be a dialectical God, and ergo an enormous amount of received theology must be wrong. God must be very different than we conceive of them, and then more different than Hegel was willing to go in conceiving of God. And the same would be true for the politics. The political structure that Hegel thrived under, he wasn't willing to question. So what happens to politics if you apply the dialectic to it? Well, you reach conclusions Hegel was afraid of. And so, again, he would take his dialectic so far and then stop. It's, one interesting place you can go with this is Kierkegaard. Even though Kierkegaard is a very different writer, if you labor your way through 40 pages of Hegel and you've just about got yourself, I can't say comfortable, but let's say you've minimized your discomfort in reading his style and his mode of argument, you can't then just turn to Kierkegaard and keep going. Kierkegaard argues in an entirely different way, so often setting up arguments between imaginary characters who represent different philosophical positions, and that you're supposed to infer what Kierkegaard thinks from the results of this argument, rather than anybody saying outright what Kierkegaard's thinking about. It makes Kierkegaard very tricky to read. But with that understood, Kierkegaard is taking Hegel's dialectics and applying it to Christianity. I mean, Hegel didn't want to change Christianity. He would only take the dialectics so far, but there's just no doubt when you look at the structure of human personality, the model of the mind and character that Kierkegaard is laying out, he is incorporating religion into it. The religious personality is a level of development in the dialectics that Kierkegaard is describing. And in order for that to be true, it has obvious implications for the nature of God. Now, Kierkegaard didn't come to that easily. He was perfectly willing to talk about the structure of the religious character in a human being dialectically, but he wasn't willing to fully accept the truly dialectical nature of God until fairly late in his life. And once he did, he created the very last things he ever wrote, which was, what today we call Attack on Christendom, which was his long series of pamphlets criticizing the sort of everyday habitual structures of the church for not following through with the message of Jesus, for not being dialectical, for being all kinds of criticisms he had. And it wasn't until he was at the end of his life that he finally was comfortable just going there. The thing that scared off Hegel, Kierkegaard finally gave in and said, we have to look at this. We have to talk about this. We have to talk about how far so many Christians fall short of Jesus's message. We have to talk about the ways in which, we're hypocrites and we don't do the things we're supposed to do. It's fascinating. It doesn't fully comfortably go as far as trying to imagine a dialectical God, but his critiques only make sense if he is trying to imagine it and then thinking, what would God make of what we have made of his church? That's sort of the focus he has in Attack on Christendom. So, Kierkegaard, Hegel, medieval theology, these are all subjects near and dear to Kenneth Smith's heart. I'm sure he'd have a lot to say. And he could probably list more philosophers who've tried to take the dialectics further into assessing what is the nature of the sacred. But in some ways, as Hegel implies when he says that there's no part of Heraclitus's philosophy that Hegel himself didn't take in and make part of his own core philosophy, I think the implication is that there is a lot of dialectics in the original ancient Greek polytheism that is not often appreciated by modern readers when we read those myths. We read them as moderns read them, as they're just fun stories. And so we miss the ways in which they're trying to show the dialectics between gnosis and noesis, with the relationship between Dionysus and Apollo, or the paradoxes of the maker and the way he entraps himself through his means-oriented short-sightedness, as we see when Daedalus traps himself in the labyrinth. I mean, all of these, especially the makings of the great tragedies, they're just rife with dialectics and the nature of the relationship between the human and the sacred. It's fascinating stuff. But James, I'm telling you, you look at what's out there, and you got to conclude the field is wide open for some philosopher, or maybe entire schools of philosophers, to go forth and really seriously try to explore the nature of the sacred when they're comfortable with dialectics, instead of trying to pin it down into the simple little noetic categories that most theologians do. It's interesting stuff. There are moments in some of Martin Luther King Jr.'s greatest speeches where I catch the aroma of the dialectics and the way he talks about what God expects of him. It's interesting stuff. So let's go to the text. Let's go to the text and see how much of this we can get through today. We're a little over halfway through today. An excellent point to begin walking through the text. So we did the first sentence last time. I'm only including it here for completeness, but really our focus is to read through to the second sentence. So here he sort of sketches the idea of form and matter and what they are briefly. And then he talks about hierarchy when he says, in animals, a head, the central concentrate of intelligence, has command over a body which is obedient and coordinated. Form governs matter. Now in this, he's not trying to tell you that's what he believes or that's what is true. He's trying to tell you that's how the ancients understood the relationship, right? they knew that somewhere in the body, even if it was the liver or wherever it was, that there was some part of a human being that was in charge. It was the upper class. It was the aristos, right? It was the source of form, and that the rest of the body was matter, and it had to comply. And that death or even unconsciousness or sleep were moments when the ruling form in charge lost its grip of control over the matter of the body, and the body would collapse into passivity, either temporarily or permanently. There's interesting, I think I mentioned this like 2 years ago, there's interesting passages in Homer that when you translate them literally seem to imply that the Mycenaeans, the Homeric Greeks, believed that the parts of the body only held together through the will. Not just that they only moved according to the will, but that they even formed a whole according to the will. And that when the will was no longer present, they fell apart into parts again, like a puppet whose strings have been cut. They had a really absolute concept of a separation between form and matter when it came to the nature of the human body and its relationship to its own mind. It's fascinating to look at. But if you think about a hyper class society that's obsessed with maintaining a strong line between the conquerors and the conquered, the rulers and the subjects, you can see why they would draw an equally strong mind than metaphorically everywhere else they constructed a form and matter dichotomy. So yeah, sure, your body must have your mind must have absolute authority over your body. The sort of things that we've learned since then, the ways in which the mind is altered by the body, the ways in which your gut bacteria can determine if you're happy or not, or if you're prone to depression. It could be determined by what's in your intestines. It's not even your own cells, and they're shaping and directing your body, your brain, in ways that to somebody obsessed with this separation between the body and the mind would seem to be anathema, some kind of heresy. But when we think about it, it's more Greek, it's more naturalistic, it's more dialectical to understand that the relationship between the mind and the body is going to be dialectical. They're going to interpenetrate each other, and they're going to affect each other. That is just like a woodworker who's got his carving tools in his hand only has partial control over the wood, only to the extent that he knows the wood and works with the grain and doesn't make the mistake of trying to work against the grain when he shouldn't. Only then does he maintain his control. And it's the same with the body. If I in preparation for 11 hours of Kobudo seminar this weekend, if on Friday I do too many leaps into a deep stance over and over and over, I'm going to injure my ankle, and that's going to get in the way of my ability to control my body throughout the seminar. And that's what happened, right? I was doing exactly what a poor craftsman does in thinking that I had absolute control over my body, when the truth is I only have a cooperative level of control. And I have to work with the body and its limits and not try to go against it. So, but anyway, this idea of absolute separation between the two was very appealing to a hyperclass society of the Mycenaeans. As Greek civilization went on, as the flaws in the extremist Mycenaean positions became evident through the collapse of their civilization, the Greeks became more naturalistic. They had more centuries living with the indigenous inhabitants of the Greek peninsula to soak in more of the naturalism, the understanding of the ways in which nature rules us, until by the time they reemerge in the Archaic period, when you're seeing Thales and Heraclitus and others writing, now nature is back in its position of authority. And the gods are more expected to work within nature than to simply violate it. And so, by extension, the relationship between the ruling class and the slaves, the relationship between the mind and the body, these have all become far more nuanced by the time we come out of that dark age than they were, in Homer's ancient epic. So the idea of the separation of the active and the passive, the designer and the designed, these are now being seen as the beginning of understanding, not the whole of understanding. And it's only when we put them into the proper dialectical relationship that the Greeks think you have real wisdom here. The second paragraph, I think that'll go in. But everything in the order of nature is such a formed or self-forming matter. This goes back to Donald's quick side reference to the difference between clay and a living thing. That is, organisms manifesting specific strategies for holding a specific kind of something together. This is critical to his point, right? Because when he's talking about the nature of autonomy and free will in a person, we're moving beyond the question of what can clay do. We're moving into the question of what can a living thing do that exists in sympathecy with its environment, that is in a learning relationship where it's sensing what's happening and it can change its own behavior to make things better. This is what it's like when we try to form ourselves. He's arguing that as mortals, the duration of our life is determined by how long we can hold ourselves together. He says, to the Greeks, this is one of the main separations between mortals and immortals. The gods are not constantly working against a clock. They're not constantly fighting a losing battle to cohere and make themselves alive. The thing that separates them from us is that their powers of recreation, their ability to make themselves and to form themselves, are so great that they're inexhaustible, effectively. That's what the Greeks thought was separating them from us. But by contrary, what that means, the other side of the coin, is to be immortal is to be like any other living thing, not just active and not just passive, but in this paradoxical state in which you can only continue to exist as long as you continue to make yourself, shape yourself, hold yourself together. And when you aren't able to do that anymore, that's the day of your death. That's what leads to your death. And in war, if somebody wounds you with a sword, their goal is to damage your ability to hold yourself together to bring on that death sooner. But ultimately, it's the same kind of death, whether you die of a sword in battle or whether you die in bed at age 99. It's because you've lost your ability. The form has lost its power, its hold over the matter of the body. This was a Greek conception. This is what he's saying here. And interestingly, what he's about to say is that when we compare living and non-living materials, what we see is that living materials have greater powers of self-cohesion. In some ways, that's one of the definitions of life. Whereas non-living things are more passive in their powers of self-cohesion. A cat cuts its paw, but as long as things don't go wrong, its paw will heal and it goes back to being a complete cat again. But a statue of a cat, you chisel off part of the paw or just put a gouge in it, and it's never going to heal because granite doesn't have those powers of self-cohesion and self-creation and self-repair that the actual cat has. The core to life is this power that it has in which it forms the matter of itself into itself at all times. And so just like it did it in the womb when it went from one cell to a full cat, so it does it out in its everyday life after it's born. It keeps reshaping itself. And the healing that we see, that is sort of confusing and a mystery in some ways to a mechanistic Newtonian picture of human beings, makes perfect sense within the ancient Greek perspective, in which all living things are they exist because they're in effect healing themselves at every moment. And death comes when they can't do that anymore. So he says wood has its own kind of fibrous integrity. Granite has its own interlocking cohesion. Even water has its subtle surface tension and self-absorption, particle into whole. And this is a powerful illusion of the relationship of parts to wholes. This is what architect Christopher Alexander made his entire career out of, is talking about the way that living structure results from the relationships of parts to wholes. Specific kinds of relationships in which the parts work together to create the whole, to generate it as their overall form, in which they make themselves the matter of the whole. It's kind of esoteric stuff, except Christopher Alexander illustrates it relentlessly with photos and diagrams and drawings. And pretty soon you realize that what he's talking about is the principle of every tree, every cat, every person, every beach, every sand dune, every river system, anything that holds itself together does it this way. It's fascinating. It gets into a way of sort of explicating part of the ancient Greek conception of the dialectics of nature and the way that things exist through change, as Heraclitus says. Things are at rest only by changing, right? Anybody who works in medicine knows why don't you die of high blood pressure? Why don't you die of low blood pressure? Because the systems in your body are endlessly monitoring your blood pressure, and they're endlessly adjusting their dance to increase one set of hormones or the other set of hormones so that the body will shift. They'll constrict the blood vessels. They'll dilate the blood vessels. They'll make the spleen squeeze or make it relax. They'll generate more platelets or less platelets. The body is constantly working to create what we mistake for a status quo. It isn't a status quo. It is a relentless dance that gives the illusion of a status quo. All that changing to be at rest, like Heraclitus says, that's the basis of life. So that's what he's talking about here. He's talking about the way things hold themselves together, the way that they can exist through self-creation. Over millennia, even granite erodes. Water evaporates far sooner, and gases such as clouds or breath dissipate even faster, having only minimal forces of form. Minimal forces of form, right? Which is why it's so shocking when a tornado or a waterspout or a hurricane comes in, because the thing that we have so long associated as being somehow less coherent than ourselves, who are physical beings and not just airy, suddenly has the power to hurl us about or tear apart a building. It's like, where did it come up with these powers of self-cohesion that a hurricane could be a hurricane and a tornado could be a tornado, when, yesterday the air was seemingly nothing at all. It was so tenuous, its grasp. You can see why one of the ancient Greek philosophers thought air was the source of all things. That it had, even though it seemed to be a nothing, it had these powers to generate a something seemingly out of nothing. All natural existence has its own distinctive tenure on existence, its way of resisting dissolution pro tempore. Pro tempore. Of course, I had to look up pro tempore, and I always do this with this stuff. What the hell is he talking about? What is our terminology? But pro tempore only means temporarily, so it really wasn't such a mystery as I thought it was. But, there's a couple of themes in here before I go into the next paragraph that we want to draw attention to. And one of them is Stephen's concept that he raises from time to time of centrifugal versus centripetal. Centrifugal versus centripetal, right? As we know from section A, right, all of nature is becoming. It's always in the process of change and flow. It's the great river you can't step in twice, because it's changed by the time you step again, and so have you. So in such a context, what happens to a pile of sand when the tide comes in? The tide's going to pull it apart. There's all these forces at work, and if nothing in that pile of sand works to self-cohere it, then the tide will work to pull it apart, right? With all the to and fro of the energies in this dynamic system we live in, it takes enormous powers of self-cohesion to exist at all over time and to not just be washed away. This is the centrifugal dimension. Nature in a state of continual flux is centrifugal, pulling things apart. And life, therefore, is a principle found in nature, a counter principle by which some things in nature pull themselves together in opposition to the forces that are trying to pull them apart. This is what this whole subject of form and matter is here. He's not just trying to talk about the dichotomy between, what is the shaper and what is the shaped. He's trying to say, to exist at all as an individual, as a character, as a personality, as an intelligence, as a culture, as a species, requires formidable powers of centripetal self-cohesion. Because without that, by default, the tides of nature will pull us apart and will stop being us, right? It's not that the sand doesn't exist anymore, it's that it's scattered to the winds. It no longer is the little pyramid that the 4-year-old carefully built on the beach. The pyramid is gone. The sand continues in other forms, in other places, in other times. And the same is true with us. Everything in us is borrowed, and it's got other places to be. And when we can't be bothered to pull ourselves together anymore, then we cease to be, and something else takes our place. Many something elses. We contribute to a lot of other things. And this is the nature of life and death. So here in the Greeks, what he's showing is how you start with such a simple idea, like the idea of nature in a constant state of flux and as authoritatively true. And then we add to it this idea from section B, right? Custom and nature, aristocracy and philosophy. We talk about this thing about the human existence within that flux, the human as the unfinished animal, as Pico would later say, that needs a culture to help fill us in and help give us an identity. We talk about how, you know, our culture is our stupid pet trick. It's what makes us who we are, so that we have this enormous variety that other animals don't have. And then he pulls it together into the implications of what does it mean to be such an animal in such a world? And what it means is our ability to endure is dependent upon our formative, cohesive powers, our centripetal powers. They're central to everything. And it's part of why, to the Greeks, as we'll see in the later sections, it's so important that culture be deliberately cultivated and passed on to the next generation, because they are well aware that by default, if we don't pass on the things that matter, they'll be lost. That's what nature does. It pulls things apart and through the tides and through the flux. Yes, it creates, but it destroys at the same time. And if we don't want that default behavior to apply to us, we have to think outside that box. We have to think about how we can create new cohesion, and that includes intergenerational cohesion. How we can pass on the things that matter. To the Greeks, this was an obsession. So this thing that he's bringing up, this is critically important. Okay, let's go on to the next paragraph. And this was the one that that Phil was quoting earlier. So we'll start with the first half of it here.
Which section are you reading, Rick?
We're in section
C.
C.
Okay.
I can give you the link again in case you don't have it.
Okay, I have 3 and 4, but I'm not sure where you're at exactly.
So in the chat, I just posted the link. That's to End Times chapter 4.
Okay.
So if you click on that and then scroll down to section C,
Okay.
we're now at the beginning of the 3rd paragraph in C.
Okay, got it. Thank you.
Sure. So now he says, everything is what it is in virtue of characteristic defining forces. The Heraclitus is all over this, right? The bow seems to be lying there on the table, but it's a bow only because the wood and the string have been strung together in opposition to each other to create a powerful dynamic system. The powerful dynamic system is what looks to us like an object, but it's actually a struggle between opposed forces that have been harnessed together so that they can create this energy. So he's saying things are what they are, never passively. They never just are, but always because they're in the process of creating each other, creating themselves through enormous energies that have been strung together and harnessed. You know, I'm just going to take a moment to underscore the weirdness and ubiquity of this observation. We all think we know what water is because we drink it all the time. It's everywhere. It makes up most of our bodies. It falls on our heads. It's all over the place, right? Water. What could be more normal than water? And yet Hegel tells us what is familiar is for that very reason not recognized for what it truly is. So let's talk about water. H2O, right? That's water. Only if you talk to a chemist, they'll say, not exactly. They'll say, yes, you start with H2O. But as you may recall, if you dump things into water, water has the ability to dissolve a lot of them. Like you put salt in water and stir, and pretty soon there's no pile of wet salt at the bottom. It's all gone somewhere. The question is, well, where did it go? It's one of the favorite things to do when you're first teaching chemistry to kids. You're like, okay, you definitely have this much salt. You definitely have this much water. You put the salt in the water and you stir, and now you only have water? Where did it go? Where the object has vanished. But it's not just as simple as the fact that it's vanished. What's happened is that water has a weird structure where the hydrogen atoms can't hang on to their electrons as effectively as the oxygen can. The oxygen has a bigger nucleus with more protons. It has more pulling power. So even though in theory, the two hydrogens on the Mickey Mouse ears and the oxygen that is the head of the Mickey Mouse, you know, in theory, they're sharing those electrons. It's a covalent bond. They share the electrons in order to be balanced. In truth, the electrons spend more time around the oxygen than they do around the two hydrogens because the gravity well, it's not gravity, the electrical attraction of that pile of protons inside the oxygen is stronger. So it's got them more often. Now, what that means is the two ears of the Mickey Mouse head of water are a little bit positive because the electrons aren't there as often. And the big head of the Mickey Mouse head, where the oxygen is a little bit negative because it's got those two extra electrons spending more time there than they do up in the ears. And as a result, it has what's called a polar charge. You know, the shape of the molecule, one side is more positive and one side is more negative. So the most interesting thing happens when you get a bunch of H2O in water. Right away, it aligns itself into a lattice, right? So that one molecule of oxygen and another molecule of oxygen will turn so that one of the positive ears of the first molecule is sort of pointing towards the negative head of the other molecule. And then other Mickey Mouse heads will do the same thing. Head to ears, head to ears, head to ears. You get this whole lattice shape. It just structures itself that way. And part of the reason why water has a surface tension the way that it does, part of the reason why water behaves the way it does, is because internally it's not just a big pile of molecules. They've actually organized themselves into this lattice structure that as the water moves and shifts and different things happen, it will try to put itself back into that structure over and over and over. Well, that's pretty weird, right? I mean, unless you've taken chemistry, you probably didn't know that water does that. But it gets weirder. Because one side is more positive and one side is more negative, water has this power when it's given a molecule like salt to pull the salt into pieces. And the negative half of the salt goes and gets attractive to the positive part of the water. The positive part of the salt gets pulled away and attracted to the negative side of the water. And so it rips the salt apart into a sodium ion and a chloride ion. And that's why the salt dissolves. It's literally being ripped apart into individual atoms that are sort of sticking onto the ears or head, respectively, of the water and becoming part of the larger structure. That is, the salt isn't just floating around in the water the way that we're taught in elementary school. The salt is literally becoming part of the lattice structure, attracted to where the positives and negatives are on the Mickey Mouse head. It's weird, right? But it's a well-known property of water. Many things that we do with water in cooking absolutely depend on the fact that you can stir stuff in the water and a lot of it will just dissolve into it and become part of the structure. And, you know, if you're cooking vegetables, salty water is a much tastier medium than water without any salt in it. We heavily exploit this feature. But here's the weirdest thing about water of all. I'm trying to underscore the cohesiveness that he's talking about. This ability of water to tear apart other molecules based on which part is positive and which part is negative is so strong that water even tears itself apart. An enormous amount of water is not actually H2O. What they actually do is rip off one of the Mickey Mouse ears. So you're left with an OH on one side and just an H by itself on the other. And those will go stick to parts of the Mickey Mouse ears of other water molecules. And they create this more complicated structure, which is partly H2O, partly OH, and partly H. And that lattice structure has its own look and its own geometry that it would stabilize in. You'd think, okay, it's more annoying now, but yes, I can, given some time and paper and pencil, I can draw a picture of all the little Mickey Mouse heads, some of which have been pulled apart and are blah, blah, I got it. It's like, but that structure too has the same qualities as the previous water lattice. So now it pulls some of the new lattice apart. It turns out this happens ad infinitum. It keeps creating more and more exotic combinations of oxygen and hydrogen in weird molecules just because it can't stop tearing itself to pieces and reforming itself into lattices. So water is relentlessly in the process of reconfiguring itself, and it never stops. It only gets disrupted when somebody throws something else in there, like salt. which is more interesting, if you will, to water chemically to react with. And so it leaves off messing with itself and goes and messes with the salt and rips it apart. Or, you know, silver or iron or whatever you want to dissolve in there, that gives the water something else to do. And it you know, it kind of gets distracted because that's a stronger influence. But once it has stabilized with the salt that's been mixed in, it then goes right back to reconfiguring itself and ripping itself to pieces and making the lattice over and over. So you know, you sit there and you take a drink of water and you think, what could be simpler than H2O? It's just two different elements in a very simple Mickey Mouse head configuration. And the answer is, it's one of the most complicated things we know about because it effectively never stabilizes. It's forever reshaping itself until we interrupt it. And hardly anybody knows this because we don't teach this in popular culture because it's not a simple answer. And in modernity, we love simple answers. So we teach people the little cartoon version of water, and they all think that's how water actually works. But it doesn't at all. In hindsight, it's not so surprising that water should be the basis of life because it's one of the weirdest, most mysterious, most relentlessly transformative things we know about. It's amazing. Donald, go ahead, come off mute.
Well, now I feel bad about having skipped some chemistry. but I wanted to go back a little bit. This is for Sharon. We're going to discuss the text pedantically, where it says everything is what it is in virtue.
Yes.
And that seems to me that, you know, I thought about that in virtue as opposed of as a result of,
yes,
in consequence. Why did Kenneth say virtue? Well, I'm a believer that anytime he writes virtue, he's writing arete, the Greek virtue, which is an inherent power or force or potential of some organism or being. It's those things that can become excellences. In fact, that's another translation often for virtues is excellences. I know he once told me that he said like Aristotle, the edge is the virtue of the knife. Without the edge, there is no knife. You know, it's that this defining potential. And I think that's what it is here. These are characteristic. They are from the character, the ethos of this is sort of almost some of that moral language or that we had earlier, but
yes,
but we're seeing that these are sort of inherent in nature more clearly. And I think what Kenneth is drawing our attention to, that it's the character of an organism as given by its inherent virtues that are define the forces. If you don't know the excellences of the organism, you don't know the forces that it has available to it. And as a second part, I'll tell Kenneth's Italian joke, which I think he got from that book, The Italians, by
Barzini.
That a Brit says, never kick a man when he's down. An Italian says, there's no better time.
Yes.
But, yeah. Well, I don't know. I don't know if that's true, but I know that that's a funny thing about the characters. We're talking about the characters or ethos of peoples, And do they really have, are cultures real, and do they form their participants? And
Right.
that was a funny way to say it.
It is.
They are. But more seriously, virtue, arete, ethos, the defining forces, the dynamos.
Yes.
Yeah, this is the sentence always struck me initially as that's kind of an awkward wording,
Uh-huh.
but I don't think it is. I think it's an intentional wording that where he's trying to say it, put in English, Heraclitus again.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. I'm so glad you brought that up, Donald. I mean, this first clause of this sentence is classic Kenneth Smith. It's easy to think he's making a straightforward statement until you realize the word arete is right there in the subtitle of this section. And if we're talking about arete, we're talking about human character. And there's the word characteristic, right? And character through Heraclitus is defined as the nature within us that makes us who we are, lawfully, that sets up the order that determines our behavior. And of course, character is fate that determines our fate, our outcomes. We're talking about life and death and how things end up. Fate is directly relevant here. To what extent can you hold yourself together? Likewise, just as in nature, the character of nature is defined by the archai, the deep principles that are fountains of order that generate all the things that we see. So within a human personality, the character is made up of our virtues and vices, which function as the equivalents of the archai in the human internal nature that makes up our mind. And they too, rather than being laws or rules or whatever moderns have them confused for, to the ancients, they too are fountains of order that are generating patterns and order that results in our behavior and our feelings and our thoughts.
Going down 2 sentences,
Yeah.
I think there's that play on virtue and virtuosity.
Yes.
That the skill that an actor has is a virtue. It's an excellence. It's the old thing where existentialists here, we don't have to find out what all human virtues are until somebody shows that human beings can do this and they can do it better. And then that sets a standard. And so the actor, the musician, even, the accountant or the soldier, show us different virtues in their virtuosity. They're showing up their virtue.
Yes.
He's not, these are not just casual. I'm convinced. This is something we learn about how organisms' virtues become manifest so that they can be seen and understood by others. So enough.
No, it's not. It's right on the money. I mean, you're right, Donald. And you can tell when you start just. So for Geneva's benefit, one of the things that we've said before that we haven't said recently is that half the key to understanding how to read Kenneth Smith is to build a vocabulary list of charged terms and special quotes that he goes back to over and over and over, because that's how he writes these essays. Before he writes them, he sits down and collects a bunch of quotes that inspire him, that he knows are on the subject. And he makes a vocabulary list of the key terms from existentialist philosophy or elsewhere, or even from art, that he knows are charged with meaning in this area. Frequently, these are terms that come from Hegel or Nietzsche or what have you, where they have acquired a special potent meaning because of that. And then armed with that list of terms and that list of quotes, he then writes his thing, constantly thinking about that. You find a sequence like everything is what it is in virtue, ding, 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 of characteristic, ding, 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 defining forces. Now we're back to Heraclitus, ding, 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 ding. And then later down, there's virtuosity, bing, 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 bing. And at the final sentence of this, life calls for an intelligence more like art than science. Life calls for an intelligence more like art than science. Well, this is, if if, we've talked before about the mysteries of how do you define the third mode of intelligence that Hegel talks about. Hegel says we have to overcome the initial mode of intelligence we're born into, Begriff, and we negate that and push off from it to develop our intellect, our Verstand. And then he says, but that too is a trap. It's another basal metabolic function of the mind. The adult mature intelligence is a third form called Vernunft. And then he doesn't define it clearly for us. Not as easily, not as straightforward. And we struggle because Begriff and Verstand have such straightforward definitions. We can come to understand what they are, but then we're like, well, then what's Vernunft supposed to be? And this is Kenneth partly responding, saying that intelligence that is more like art than science because it refuses to be constrained by noesis. It brings both your noesis and your gnosis to bear in a sensitive, nuanced, tasteful combination that applies the right perspective at the right time to try to see past the blinkers of the human mind to what's actually existentially happening. That's Vernunft. It's that willingness to throw aside on one moment your feelings, but then the next moment your favorite ideologies, and to go back to your feelings. You have to be able to go back and forth based on what does each one show or hide to try to triangulate and figure out what might really be there, separate from our warped perceptions. Vernunft is that mode of adult mature thought that Hegel's referring to. So all of this stuff is bound together here in these concepts of character and fate and the relationship of the individual to culture, free will to determinism. All of the most charged things are here. The only way this happens is, I mean, Donald and I can see it because we spent so much time with Kenneth. And David, likewise. Obviously, Kenneth has worked and reworked and reworked this paragraph until it's pulling together all the most important threads for his argument to say, see, these are the other things you should be reading to understand what I'm saying here. So we'll come back to it in a moment, but yeah, and there's nature. You can hardly turn a line in this paragraph without finding another one of his charged terms. This is meaty stuff here. Stephen, then Phil, then, oh, actually we haven't heard from Donna today, so I'm going to do Donna first, then Stephen, then Phil. So go ahead, Donna. Whoever's not spoken always gets first in line.
Okay, I wasn't prepared. And I apologize for showing up late. I couldn't avoid another meeting, but I got in as soon as I could.
You're welcome.
I have to backtrack here.
Sure.
You keep mentioning Christopher Alexander, who was a guiding light for me when I was still working in architecture.
Nice.
And are you focusing on him because Kenneth Smith was also focusing on him at any point? No. Okay. You're just impressed with him because as I've been hearing you talk about him, I realize this philosophy is expressing his design.
Yes.
His pattern language, his Oregon experiment. I mean, many of his design impulses were just that. They were supposedly architecture, but not designed from the architect's ego. They were designed from the basis of what the human needed. Exactly. And then that was applied to design form. And he also acknowledged the importance of healthy patterns of living in architecture. So I'm really impressed, but I wasn't sure if some of this was funneled through Smith initially, because, as I'm reading these paragraphs, this sounds like Christopher Alexander when he was explaining his philosophy.
Right.
I appreciate that.
That's why I bring it,
Yeah, I just want to do this other segue. And it was when you were doing your spiel on chemistry, which I understand. When I first took chemistry, I was learning in terms of that kind of structure. But recently I've been meeting with another group and we've been talking about cosmology and, the birth of the universe and multiverses and that kind of thing. And we've inevitably had to deal with chemistry at a quantum level, the quantum energy, as opposed to the structure. And underlying that structure that you're talking about is the quantum energy.
Yes.
Of the components. I don't mean to be a nerd about this, but I was thinking at yet another level. You're talking about a certain structure, certain form, but beyond that, below that form is an energy level, which is
Yes.
determining that form.
Yes.
And I don't know where I'd go with that other than saying that, because this other group I'm working with, we're so fascinated by this now, you know, how the nature of the forms that we experience on this earth, our life on this earth, can be modified drastically in those energy levels through different pressures, different temperatures. I'm sure the Greeks didn't think about this very much because we're living on this earth with the physical laws that we experience now. But it's quite a mind trip to start realizing how these shapes, these structures you're talking about, can be so drastically modified, let's say in the beginning of the Big Bang, you know?
Yes.
It's just what we're talking about right now. So yeah, I agree with you. At a level teaching, that is a great way of teaching chemistry, and try not to boggle the children's minds with quantum mechanics.
Exactly. It's like, what are
That's
they ready
all-
to learn?
That's all I wanted to say for the moment, but thank you for continuing to mention Chris Alexander. I really enjoyed him.
My pleasure, Donna. Yeah, you know, there was this movement in the mid 20th century that to us these days is sort of confusingly named the cybernetics movement. We would think that that meant it was mostly about, you know, how to do machine human interfaces and computers. And they did investigate that. They were heavily involved in computers, but it turns out they were also heavily involved in ecology and in trying to break free of simplistic Newtonian mechanistic popular culture understandings of the world. And it is amazing how many breakthrough thinkers in the mid to late 20th century hung out with each other and talked about these things as part of the cybernetics movement. And Christopher Alexander was influenced by that. And I think that indirectly, I think Kenneth Smith was as well. He often cites people as people he's read and thought a lot about who were part of that movement. So these connections, even when he doesn't make them, they're there anyway. And of course, the main reason they're there is for the reason that Donald talks about. When this is the last point I kind of want to draw out of this before I call on Stephen and Phil, is that reference to virtue and virtuosity and the whole, we can't know in advance what all the virtues are. We can't just sit down and logically lay out a scheme that satisfies us intellectually to say this is human nature and then insist that people conform to it. That's that other branch of philosophy that Kenneth Smith talks about when he says all philosophy is either escapist or existentialist. He says to be an escapist is to insist on escaping into your own theories, that you love your theories more than you love the world, and you're willing to ignore the world if it means that your theories can, you know, take the spotlight. But an existentialist has to say, I don't know everything. I can't make you a complete system that represents nature because I'm immortal. I'm finite. My understanding will always be finite. Even if I improve my whole life long, I can only live so long. I'm only going to see so much. So what we need is a scientific approach to philosophy in which we let the world teach us things that we never could have conceived of ourselves. And this definition of existentialist philosophy, which is a little different from what people are normally taught, is the definition. You can see it in this great Greek concept that we don't know what the virtues are that make human beings able to cohere as individuals or cultures until after we witness somebody do the thing. And once we've seen it, then we know it's real. Before they did it, we didn't even know it was possible. But we watched someone willing to die for the truth. And now we know that someone's commitment to honesty could be that great. We might have told ourselves, oh, people are all liars and cheats and you can't trust them. And there's a certain satisfaction in that kind of defeatist prophecy. There's a certain pleasant passivity. But then you watch somebody like Socrates drink the hemlock rather than recant. Or you watch other examples from history, and the conclusion you reach is, I was wrong about the limits of human possibility. Because if I were right about those limits, that person could not have done what they just did. And so an escapist will say, that's an anomaly, put him on a shelf, let's not talk about him. And an existentialist will say, okay, well, it's time to change our theories because reality has surprised us once again. That's the existentialist approach to philosophy in a nutshell. And that was the driving orientation that late Greek philosophy had towards trying to understand human nature, that it had to be done existentially. Stephen and then Phil. Go ahead, Stephen.
Yeah, bringing Italians and Norwegians into it, one of the things I came across was Leon's Italian Westerns. And it's interesting how it evolved that, you know, say Leon noticed that the typical quality of an Italian story is the guy is a bit of a rat who fights to survive.
Uh-huh.
And he does bad things and he's seeking forgiveness. The Italian storyline is about a guy that does bad things looking for forgiveness, as for example in The Bicycle Thief. And well, the happy story is when the Italian gets his pot of gold at the end and lives happily ever after. And Leon had a dilemma, you know, what's the thing with these Nordics and their Western cinema, you know, the black hat and the white hat. And then he saw The Seventh Seal and that blew his mind away. This is something totally different. And he suddenly worked out that the Nordic operates on the principle of a battle between life and death.
Yes.
The white hat is life, the black hat is death. And so in his spaghetti westerns, particularly in the good, the bad and the ugly,
yes,
he weaves the elements of Italian and Nordic cinema together.
Yes.
Where Eastwood and Angel Eyes is the white knight versus, you know, the black knight, life versus death. And so that's the complexity of the story, and it becomes a very successful genre. Of course, Eastwood manages to shoot death as Bill and Ted manage to defeat death.
Right, right.
But at the very end of it, he's going to hang Tuco, but then he forgives him by shooting the rope.
Right, right.
So, yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Yeah, it's part of what's hilarious about The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly is, yeah, you've got the struggle between life and death, but you're right. The Italian story is there too. They're also kind of rats, right? He and his buddy who've been scamming town after town, you know, it doesn't change that they're scammers and that they've done that and that they have these old grudges. You know, they are still Italian at the same time that they're Nordic. It's a crazy story. I love it so much. It's just a riot. And of course, it's just dripping with style. Speaking of Italian stories, the style has to be, you know, incredibly important in an Italian story. And you watch that moment when the three of them all have guns on each other and the dramatic music from Ennio Morricone is going, and it just goes from face to face to face as they look at each other. And then you realize their expressions are changing because the camera is showing who's looking at whom, and they're changing how they feel based on what they just saw in the other guy's face. And in quick succession, they're going through a whole emotional story of looking at each other and reacting prior to the first gun bullet being shot. It's just, I mean, that is so Italian. It's just dripping with style. So thank you for that example. I have a lot of fun with that. All right, Phil, go ahead, and then back to the text.
Yeah. Several weeks ago, I had some complaints about this notion of virtue.
Yes.
And I said, yes, but for instance, if I was an individual and what I am excellent in is in the vices somehow, taking advantage, I mean, that is my virtue, right?
Right.
And in some sense, then you have a problem because you want to accentuate your virtue, but that doesn't coordinate in relationship to a larger understanding what virtue might be. So, and since we're all born to a certain degree with at least a potentiality for vice, in other words, selfishness instead of the goodness of the group or whatever it is, then there's going to be a conflict. And how do you deal with that? Do you find a great teacher who teaches you like, oh, these are your virtues, but these are the virtues that are not very good, and you need to constrain them, right? And then accentuate those things that you're not very good at. At best, you're just going to be a mediocre guy, like, then you're thinking to yourself, like, okay, like, should I go with what I'm actually meant to be, whatever that is? Or should I go and, let's say, go along and get along with everybody else? I mean, there is a problem in that, in terms of what virtue really is,
Yeah.
And so we can't just simply say the one side and just assume that if you accentuate your virtues or your characteristics, that you're in fact living a virtuous life. It's like, I'm not sure how you get rid of that. I mean, it's kind of like hard to convince somebody who is hardwired to be leaning in the direction of vice and taking advantage of this and that or whatever, and the grift, and say, no, that's not very good, you see. He said, but that's what I'm good at. Don't you know? That is my virtue. And so I think that we have to understand this word in a more complete way, because obviously there's at least two understanding of your characteristics, which is your potentiality of being excellent in whatever you do, versus like virtue in the sense of like what's ultimately good. And especially since we have a little trouble defining what that is, then it becomes a really holy mess. And I could see how society is constantly plagued by, the people who would take advantage of situation, and all the do-gooders are saying, oh, look at that guy. I mean, you see what I'm saying? And he is actually doing what he's supposed to do according to these characters. So I need a greater explanation than just this one-dimensional aspect. And maybe the dialectic would somehow uncover it, because it seems like a problem to me.
Thank you, Phil. Let's explore that. Let's explore that, because we've come to the right paragraph if we want to understand virtue. So, remember that one of the core themes of Kenneth Smith's philosophy is that the hardest part of doing philosophy is that all of the most important terms have already been redefined by modernity to exclude the possibility of philosophy and to exclude the possibility of any alternative to modernity. So all of these terms, their colloquial meanings, are traps. And we have to dig deeper to figure out what on earth we're talking about. And in the Romans, where virtu is, the immediate source, we get another set of problems, where as pragmatists, the Romans, were anti-philosophical and would only talk about virtue in terms of things as usefulness. So anything could have a virtue. The virtue of a pan is that it lets you, cook your bacon. The virtue of, everything has a use value virtue. And none of this had anything to do with the original Greek conception that we're talking about here. So this is worse than a lot of other philosophical terms, in that you can't just dig out of the modernist layers, which is almost impossible for most people to do. You also then have to dig through previous layers of misinterpretation and reinterpretation. But what we see in here in this chapter is we're talking about the problem of life and death. We're talking about the problem of cohesion and identity, and what allows you to exist centripetally. What forces are harnessed to create a centripetal force that holds you together so that you can continue to live, as opposed to what centrifugally flings you apart. This is the context for this discussion of virtue. And so in some sense, he's saying, you know, as Donald says, the awkward wording of this clause, everything is what it is in virtue of characteristic defining forces, is saying the defining forces of your character that are not dissipative, but are integrative and allow you to hold together are virtues. And those that are dissipative, that cause you to, that go along with the tides of the world flinging you to pieces, those are vices. And that's too simple-minded an answer, but it's a beginning of an answer. And where the complexity comes in is that this isn't just true of you as an individual, but it's also true of your relationship to the larger whole, to your family, to your culture, to your species, to the ecosystems of the world. Each of these layers, we have to re-examine the question of, is this quality that we have under consideration to ask ourselves as its virtue, is it acting centripetally for yourself, but at the expense of everybody else, so that it's actually centrifugal, more destructive than it is constructive? Or is it somewhere in between, a kind of paradox to where it is both at the same time pulling you together and pulling you apart? Things can be right on those lines, as Heraclitus warns us, pretty often. And if that wasn't complicated enough, as Christopher Alexander says, all wholes are made up of parts, including you as a whole. So what we take as an individual, for an individual analysis, we then have to look deeper into the centers that make you up, and how does the virtue affect, the potential virtue affect each of those different centers. So maybe you feel like it's good for you as a whole because, you know, it strengthens your will and allows you to get your way more often. But then maybe a Heraclitean analysis of what it is that you want for your way actually turns out to be self-destructive, and, you know, you're drinking yourself into liver cirrhosis and killing yourself. And so what seems you know, from the perspective of the whole to be a virtue, for this perspective of the part turns out to be a vice. And then as a result, it, you know, ends up in this paradoxical relationship for the whole. So that's got to be as clear as mud. And, you know, I take a bow at this point for obscuring the point, but actually the issue here is that it's a very complicated subject. Even though in theory, what's at stake is straightforward. Centripetal or centrifugal. I mean, it's why every time Stephen would bring up this pair of words over the last year, I was always nodding and smiling, because, I mean, this is core to the ancient worldview. This concern about centripetal versus centrifugal is everywhere. And it goes right to the heart of this issue of virtue. For one way to evaluate it, when you need to resolve down to a simpler evaluation out of all of the paradoxes of looking at it from all these different perspectives, is from the perspective of Greek paideia, from the recognition that to create a culture that cultivates good people is very hard. It's just incredibly difficult. And it's impossible if instead of a culture, you have an anti-culture, and its whole purpose is to exploit people's weaknesses instead of helping to mitigate them and weave them together into something sustainable. So in modernity, it's almost impossible to conceive. But if we could imagine a culture that was actually focused on how to mitigate the worst in people and help strengthen the best in them so that they could, oh God, I'm going to use a Rogerian term, self-actualize into the best forms of themselves, so that culture as a whole could grow and develop and be the most sustainable. Then one of the ways to describe that would be in terms of the characteristics that we wish people had, like honesty, or truth-seeking. Even more important than honesty, is more important than blathering out whatever nonsense I have in my head, is, am I committed to looking beyond the nonsense in my head to search for the truth, right? That's more valuable than just being candid. It's a higher virtue, because it allows us to overcome dogmas and doxa and so forth. So the, you know, Greeks like Aristotle, who wrote about virtue and tried to develop a theory of virtues, this is the level at which they were most concerned. It's like, yes, what helps you to scrape by the money to pay your rent this month? you know, if you con other people and it allows you, and they could spare the money and you couldn't. And now as a result, you get to survive and they aren't really harmed. Maybe that's a virtue at some level. One of these levels I was talking about before, at the levels of complexity and nuance. But at the level of anthropoculture and paideia, of trying to make a Homo sapiens into something, you know, that's a going concern, it might not be a virtue. That might not be the best way to go about it. There might be alternative virtues that are better to have because they could help you, but not at the expense of the whole at the same time. This is why axiology is an entire field of philosophy. There's no simple answers. It's like a discipline you study for the rest of your life, trying to get to the bottom of things.
Well, let me follow this by asking this question, because the problem is existence. You have some choice in regard to choosing the dimension of your existence. You know that you're not alone, but the dimension you choose could be a very broad scope,
Yeah.
or slightly narrow and slightly very narrow.
Yeah.
And so then it becomes a problem. I'll give you an example of what I mean in actual life. You know, when I was younger, I was actually a very good wrestler, very, very good. And I remember at one wrestling match at the tournament, this older wrestler, who obviously saw the potential of me being a pretty darn good wrestler, gave me some good, I'll put that in quotes, good advice. He says, Philip, you know, when you're wrestling with somebody, you have to like give it a lot more pain. When the official is not looking, you have to cheat and hurt the guy a little to let them know this is for real. You know, I mean, it's like, of course, you don't do it in front of the ref. And, you know, it's like that is the thing that's going to make the difference between winning and losing. Okay. So I was very much into wrestling. And I thought to myself, oh, this is very interesting. Like, on the one hand, I appreciate this guy who was the wise man of wrestling, or one of the wise men of wrestling, which saw in me the potential to want to give me good advice, helpful advice.
Mm-hmm.
But on the other hand, here I am as a young man, I'm saying like, no, this guy is absolutely stupid. I'm already way beyond him, right? I don't want to do that, you know? And so I didn't take his advice, but in thinking about it later on, as I thought about it, I did see that when you graduated from high school, for instance, when you go to college, everyone on the team is a league champion.
Mm-hmm.
So that's already on a fairly high level, okay? And for you to make it to be now part of the team, not just this extras, you have to excel yourself and saw what it is. And then, okay, you could get very good and become a league champion. And to the degree that I was very good at what I did, I felt I could possibly at some point, just through my raw skill, win. But I've seen some wrestlers who are equally as good, better than myself. And I said, what would happen in that situation? Let's say now you go to not only a league championship, which perhaps I had the potential of becoming, very iffy, but nonetheless, let's say I did and I passed that and I went to, let's say, the regional champion on the college level. All these guys are as good or better than you are.
Mm-hmm.
And what makes the difference is, and I saw it in the math, their will to win is so extraordinary, above mine, you know, like I still saw it as kind of a game, you know, I could take it or leave it because my heart was really in art, right? And I knew I couldn't win there, let alone go to the nationals and let alone making the Olympic team, all that. I mean, so therefore his advice in that dimension of existence was very good advice, because these guys, you think you're good now. I mean, you are going to face somebody who is better than you. And how are you going to get to the Olympics, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I said, no, this is not for me. And I eventually quit wrestling because I knew that I did not have the will to win to that degree, okay?
Mm-hmm.
Because I really thought about my humanity is a greater virtue than that particular virtue.
Mm-hmm.
And so what I'm saying is that if individuals such as myself or individual have a choice between these different frameworks or different dimensions of existence, then there are going to be people who choose the narrower frame or the tighter frame or whatever the frame is, and they will continue to act virtuously to the degree they don't care about hurting the other guy, right? They came into the match, they asked for it, they deserve it. I mean, I guess that's how you would look at it, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's me or you kind of thing. And
Yeah.
so I'm thinking, well, if that is applied throughout society and people have the freedom to choose various frameworks or dimensions of existence, then yeah, of course, they could be very virtuous in, let's say, being a robber baron. And look at all the good things they do. People are getting richer, all that kind of stuff, right? So they could talk themselves into thinking, you know, I'm doing more good than bad,
Mm-hmm.
you know? And so that's why, I mean, I have a problem with that, because now if it came down to the fact, no, you don't have any choice in terms of choosing your dimension of existence, then of course you would say, well, you're treading on my autonomy,
Yes.
my freedom, right? You're oppressing me. And so that becomes another problem. So I'm saying it's just a very difficult thing to get
It is.
around
It is.
by that definition.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Yeah, I mean, it's a nest of paradoxes. It's a tough area.
Yeah.
It's hard to resolve. You know, I think of the example of Surya Bonali, who's one of our favorite figure skaters. She was really big 20 years ago. She was from France. She was a black figure skater in a world that's mostly white. I mean, like conspicuously white. And, you know, partially it's about the fact that, you know, you get more snow and ice up north in Europe than you do down in Africa. But there's plenty of black people in Africa, and mostly, you know, they didn't find a real welcome area in professional figure skating. But what was interesting about Surya Bonali is that she was professionally classically trained in France. She was national figure skating champion in France. She was European figure skating champion many, many times. But whenever she tried for the Olympics, the judges heaped criticism on her. They'd watch, you know, exactly what was the position of her foot on the landing, and did they like, what about her wrist? Was that in the right position? And they would always tell you, well, we have to grade her down because look at these technical deficits that she has. But meanwhile, you'd watch the next figure skater who was a favorite, and they might make the same mistakes and not get called on it. So there was a thumb on the scale that was being used. And everybody knew it. Everybody knew that there was some corruption in the figure skating judging world, and that it was getting bad. And it was partially because the audiences went wild for Surya Bonali. She was not just brilliantly trained and determined and incredibly artistic, but she was hugely strong and innovative. She trained and trained and trained relentlessly. And so she could pull off moves other people couldn't do. And so in order to sort of, you know, she made the decision that rather than try to bend herself into a pretzel to please the judges, who maybe couldn't be pleased anyway, to win, she would instead choose to lose in a way that was obviously the winning performance, so that the crowds went wild, and all the professional evaluators, not just people who are ignorant, but even the professional evaluators would look at her performance and go, that's the most amazing thing I've ever seen, and those judges should be hanged. You know, that was her goal, was to do that well. And in that, you can catch the whiff of that Greek concept of competition and arete, the pursuit of excellence and virtuosity. It came to a peak when she was routinely including backflips in her programs, which most of the skaters couldn't do at all. And they outlawed them. They said, no, it's not okay, because a figure skating jump, you have to land on one leg. And so the backflip, it's not because it's you and we'd have to give you the gold medal and we don't want to. It's that you landed on two legs and you can't land on two legs, and that's not okay. And as they knew, as everybody knew, you can't do a backflip and land on one leg. It's just too much body momentum to try to stop with the muscles of one leg balanced on a thin little blade of steel on the ice. It can't be done. So what does she do? But she goes away and develops a backflip that she can land on a single leg, and she pulls it out during the Olympics. And in the middle of this performance, well, the judges are there going, I didn't like her leg position. I didn't like her wrist position. She's jumping these triple axles and all these other amazing jumps that most of the women skaters can't do. And then she lands the ban. This jump hasn't even been banned yet because it didn't occur to them that somebody could do a backflip and land on one leg. So she pulls that off in the middle of the whole world watching. And the crowd jumps to its feet and roars because we've never seen anything like that. We're watching at home and we're screaming our heads off. Cats are bolting out of the room. And the judges still wouldn't give it to her. They're like, I don't know. But she knew that was going to happen. That was, in fact, her whole goal. Her whole goal was to give the performance of her life, to advance the art into doing what people, until she did it, they thought it was impossible. But once she did it, they couldn't say it was impossible anymore. And to force them through their actions to admit that they just didn't like her and they were never going to give her the gold no matter what. She could do the impossible, which was not yet banned because they hadn't thought of it. It could be the most amazing performance of all time, and still they wouldn't give it to her. And that made her argument far better than any kind of, writing complaint letters or, lobbying the Olympic Committee or any of that. So that's what she did. She opted for the heuristic solution, which is to make history and blow the boundaries and extend the realm of the possible, and to just leave the rest of it to history to judge for themselves. And in that, we see a kind of self-sacrifice in the name of virtue, right? Plenty of other skaters who were almost at her level wouldn't do anything like that because they knew they needed the judges to love them and respect them and give them the points in order for them to get the medals, and the medals would lead to the advertising deals that would make them the money, that would give them their careers. They weren't willing to sacrifice themselves and their careers in order to attain the social goods, but she was. And in doing that, it connects her to people like Achilles, right, or Odysseus, who were willing to cause trouble to do the right thing. And this is why modernity tries to eliminate Aristoi, is because people like that rock the boat, and modernity doesn't want the boat to be rocked. So all of that is sort of hiding here in this topic of virtues. What Donald jokingly wrote a little while ago, and 20 minutes ago in the comments, when he said, Phil, do you need an Aristos to watch over you, so that you'll know what virtue is? In some sense it's funny, but in another sense, and Donald knows this, it's right on the money. You've heard Donald say before that Kenneth Smith will say over and over, it's almost impossible to define Aristeia. The easiest thing to do is just show you an Aristos. At least it was in ancient Greece. Find an Aristos, follow them around and watch their behavior. And then they illustrate what Vernunft is. They illustrate what an Aristos is, an arete. They illustrate what virtues are. Our problem is we've just about exterminated them all. There's nobody to follow around. And as a result, it's impossible to believe what could it even be? And where's the room in our conception of human nature and culture where we could draw a circle and say this must be what a virtue is? And this difficulty that we have, that instead of virtues we're left with empty ideals, is the point of modernity. It's its stabilizing grace. Its great ballast is that it removes all the inspiration to follow the example of Well, nobody, because now we say people can't be like that. That's a non-person.
Donald, don't worry about me. I know what virtue is.
I'm not worried, Phil. And
It was a joke. It was a joke. So let's end up with this. Let's run through this paragraph once, so that's in the recording for people who might have been listening instead of watching. Everything is what it is in virtue of characteristic defining forces. A family of Italians, and by the way, he says Italians, he means that book by Luigi Barzini. He means the book called The Italians. I mean, you can't, once you know that Kenneth Smith has read The Italians and thinks it's hilarious and insightful, you know that if he's talking about the characteristics of Italians, he means that book. A family of Italians and a family of Norwegians are not bound together by the same culture or psychology. A horse cannot be trained by the same methods as a child or a cat. An actor or a musician cannot sustain morale and virtuosity by the kinds of routines that accountants or soldiers take for granted. Nature works an idiosyncratic chemistry on every being or creature. Nothing simply is. Existence is a variable kind of task or challenge, even a mystery of orchestrating specific resources, Heraclitus would say, forces, bending certain forces, towards specific ends. Of course, if he says ends, he's talking about telos, the Greek term telos, as in teleology, which was central to the Greek concept. Life calls for an intelligence more like an art than a science. So now we have got this concept of life and death, of self-cohesion, centripetal and centrifugal, virtue, character, Heraclitus's dynamic concept of nature as consisting of mutually harnessed but opposing forces that create dynamic power. All of this has been woven together into this framework to talk about the problem of how do we exist at all? How do we get to keep existing? How do we get to be alive for a time on the earth? To be mortal is a kind of struggle, even if it doesn't feel, even when it doesn't feel like one. Massive amounts of work take place in order to hold us together. And as soon as that stops working, then our time on the planet is over. And this is what he's going to base this whole this is what this whole section is going to talk about. It's the motivation behind exploring the problem of form and matter. How does matter form itself and hold itself together into a form? And what is the importance of arete in making it possible to have those kinds of powers? And that's our topic for this week. We'll dig more into it next week. Thanks, everybody.
Hey, thanks, everybody.
thank you, Rick.
Thank you.
And thank you, Phil.
Yeah.
Well, thank you.
Really, I would, had the opportunity arisen, I would let you educate my own children. I have absolute confidence in your judgment about virtue. Don't.
Well, maybe you should have that degree of confidence, but
High praise.
some confidence is good enough.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great week.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.